Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
The last days of October were surprisingly weatherful. This year the autumn obviously decided that it had already spoiled people enough with blue sky, warm, tender sun, and bright colors. Abruptly changing its character, it dropped cold rain with wind on the city, which quickly tore off the golden leaves from the trees and made everyone, relaxed in the warmth, remember about warm jackets and hoods. Today it had been raining since the morning. The sky was hopelessly covered in a gray shroud, and it already felt like the sun, warmth, and light had been gone for a very long time. Brandy sat on a bench under a birch tree. The huge branches of the old tree still had a decent amount of leaves and some protection from the rain. She was wearing the light jacket she'd rushed out of the house in a hurry. It was a thin summer jacket that offered no protection from the cold wind or the raindrops falling down her neck. She shivered and shoved her hands in her pockets, trying to keep warm. Her mood matched the weather surprisingly well. It was just as cold and empty, and the future, even the very near future, seemed gray and hopeless. How did we get to this point? Brandy thought wistfully. Why did we let things get this far? And more importantly, what do we do now? Resentment at the injustice, frustration and anger, confusion and loneliness all came over her at once with such force that she even shuddered. The feelings were tearing her apart, crowding her head, and tears boiled in her eyes, powerless and therefore useless. She slipped her fingers as deeply as she could into her pockets and suddenly felt something hard in her right pocket. Pulling the object out of her pocket, she clenched her fist. In the palm of her hand lay a small, scratched bronze keychain. In the center of the metal oval, the teeth of an amusing dragon smiled merrily. Brandy had been born in the year of the dragon, and this keychain, which she had long thought lost, had been given to her many years ago as a keepsake by her grandfather. The human stared at the find, scrutinizing the long, curved tail covered in scales like tenacious paws and the cheeky crest on the mythical creature's back. And suddenly she heard a quiet but clear, husky voice with a slightly mocking intonation. "Don't cry. Don't be afraid. Don't ask." She flinched and looked around in panic to see whoever had spoken the strange words. She was still completely alone in the small yard strewn with wet fall leaves. The only sounds around her were the peaceful rustling of the rain and the disgruntled cat's meow. She covered her eyes. Such familiar, but long-forgotten words rang in her head, and suddenly everything fell into place. Her head, which had just been filled with a fog, cleared up. It became perfectly clear, as if a light had suddenly been turned on in a stuffy, dark room and all the windows had been opened. Even the chill gave way to a warmth that spread inside. She felt calm, a little scared, and even surprisingly in this situation, a little cheerful. It was as if she had found her grandfather's trinket, a confidence she had lost forever. Now she knew exactly what she should do. The solution was so simple and logical that she wondered why it had taken her so long to see it. Brandy stood up resolutely from the wet bench and strode toward the entryway. She was born in a small southern town. The family was large. The head of the household, John, had 3 sons and 2 daughters. One of those daughters, the youngest of all John's children, was Brandy's mom. Of course, when the girl was born, and the number of people living in the big house greatly decreased, everyone had long ago acquired their own families and homes. Some even left their hometowns. Only daughter Piper, who had become a widow many years before, and granddaughter Brandy remained with her father, who was well into his 50s. John was a remarkable man in every sense of the word, and the very first sense, the literal sense, was immediately apparent. John was strong and powerful. Tall, broad-shouldered, possessed, it seemed, of a molded, almost palpable strength, as if visible to the eye, which seemed about to tear his shirt. He was a true American Guiderman, as if on purpose to complete the resemblance to a different hero. He had blonde, slightly curly hair, gray eyes, and straight, clear, as if chiseled facial features. John was like a monument. And just like a monument, he was unwavering. His word was firm and unbreakable, his hand steady and strong, and his temper stubborn and uncompromising. John was feared in the settlement, but loved and respected. However, they ironically added that it was more expensive not to respect Johnson, and sometimes it was simply dangerous for life. The most surprising thing in all this was that John was not a local. Many years ago, he had come from nowhere, almost from New York, and stayed here. Married a local girl, started a family and a household, and for some reason it seemed like he'd been here forever, since time immemorial. Couldn't fit in New York. Apparently he got too crowded there, so they kicked him out. They laughed at him in the settlement. His life, too, fully corresponded to his appearance, was simple, thorough, and reliable in everything. He built a large, by local standards, just a huge house. He gave birth to 5 children, one healthier than the other, and planted a whole forest of trees. Many times the life plan of any man. However, he planted trees not only out of the call of his heart, but also out of duty. John was a forester. Then, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union and all its services, this position was renamed to forester. And even later, John was surprised to learn that he was now a forest protection inspector. The people of the settlement had another name for John's profession: forest man. Our John is an ordinary forest man, because even bears get out of his way. However, no matter how he was called, the essence of his work did not change. He was in charge of a huge area that required constant attention and hard work. For almost 30 years, John walked through forests and beams, planted trees and poachers, saved animals and people. John's wife was buried when his oldest son was 17 and his youngest, Piper, was 7. She died quietly in the hospital from some sudden infection. He grieved for her in a peculiar way, as in fact he did everything in his life. He simply disappeared for 2 weeks in the taigé alone with a gun and a dog, and came back. Slimmed down, lightened with a calm and bright look, he looked around the children, as if rereading and making sure that everything was in place. Went to fix the swaying fence. Piper, as usual, had her own story full of joy and sorrow. But Piper, side her peers, who had already been in jail and had children and even grandchildren, was the first beauty in our girls. It was simply breathtaking. Nowadays, they are not born like that. The people have become more popular. The boys swarmed around her like bees around honey, except John wouldn't let anyone near her. And then the unsuccessful suitors would puff themselves up with frustration and keep silent. In her maidenhood, Piper was a rare beauty, tall, statuesque, with blonde hair braided in a braid, blue eyes, and a straight nose. She looked like she had stepped out of an American beauty painting. John's children, jokingly referred to as his brood, were all one and the same. But the youngest daughter was especially good for him. When Piper was 20 years old, she fell in love with an engineer who came to the town to build a new school. The guy was very young, just graduated from the institute. He knew nothing about life and was taking his first steps in his profession. But he was absolutely sure of 2 things. First, the construction of a building should begin with the pouring of the foundation. And secondly, he could not imagine life without that blue-eyed girl. If John Smith, Piper's father, agreed with the first statement, he had serious objections to the second. He was not going to give his daughter to the city boy, as he called Alexis, looking at his frail physique against the background of his tall, broad-shouldered sons. Alexis showed rare persistence and perseverance, though he was noisily kicked out of the house twice when he tried to matchmake. A few times he was beaten or held by the chest with care, trying not to hurt anything. Someone particularly zealous even tried to remove the rival by dirty methods. Alexis was complained to the city that instead of his direct duties, i.e., construction of a school necessary for the town, he was engaged in his personal life during working hours. However, the authors of the complaint were quickly identified, forced to withdraw it, and rumor has it that John, outraged by the slander, made the grief writer ate his essay. Piper, scandalized, threatened to run away from home if her father behaves like a despot from the Middle Ages. She went on a hunger strike, tried to break dishes, but quickly stopped, spared the cups. Father laughed, replied that it would not hurt to lose weight. And about the dishes, she decided reasonably. Finally, the girl simply threatened her father that she wouldn't listen to him anyway, because she loved Alexis very much and wanted to marry him. John listened to Piper, sighed heavily, drank half a glass of whiskey, which had never happened to him before. He went to the next street, where a city boy lived. When he got there, he startled the landlady, piled into the room, sat the former Alexis in a chair, and stared at him with a heavy, judgmental look. "Well," he thundered, after a pause, "what do you mean?" Alexis barely found an answer, amazed at his visitor's logic and brevity. "Are you going to propose to my daughter, or are you going to embarrass her for the whole village?" The wedding was a real, heartfelt one for 3 days, after which the Smith family had to rebuild their finances for a very long time. Piper and Alexis were perfectly happy. The town loved them, though they made jokes about the young husband's thinness. "It's okay, we'll feed them," John calmly replied to the humorists. They frankly admired. "Expressed it in a peculiar way. Look, beautiful," whispered one woman to another, having met on the street. "Yesterday I came to the pond, and there Velichkin, and the lovebirds are sitting, holding hands in silence, looking at each other. I opened my mouth too, but I tripped on the threshold, so I stretched out. I called them all names: the devil, the angel, and someone else. And I banged my pelvis, and that's it. They didn't even turn around. Just two crazy people, laughing, swinging." John finished school and kissed Piper, who was 7 months pregnant. He went into town for a new assignment. He never made it back. The car he was rushing to Piper's house collided with an oncoming truck and flipped over. John was killed on the spot. John did not dare to tell his daughter what had happened for a long time, although he was informed of everything. Half an hour after the tragedy, he arrived at the scene of the accident, wandered along the side of the road, shaking his head as if trying to get rid of some obsession, and collected bags of baby clothes John had bought for his unborn baby girl, scattered in the mud. Piper had turned out to be a worthy daughter of her father. No one heard her complaints and tantrums. She listened to the terrible news, collapsed quietly, and, hugging her arms around her large belly, sank awkwardly into a chair. She named the baby girl by the rare name Brandy. She really liked the way it sounded. She was sure that the child's name held the future in some way. The child's destiny is actually 2 words for peace and fame, she explained to surprised relatives. So what? Together world fame? Are you going to raise a star? They ironized. Well, okay. As long as your snotty little starlet will grow up to the Oscars or the Olympics will not win. What should we call her, Mirko or Slavko? Slavko is a man's name. It's not Mirko or Slavko, it's Brandy. And you're being ironic about the star. We'll see about that, Piper said firmly. As for the grandfather, he acted in accordance with his character. When he heard his granddaughter's name, he was stunned. He looked at his daughter, twiddled his thumb at his temple, and suddenly said, "You can go as crazy as you want and call the child whatever you want, but I will call my granddaughter Marisa." And so it went. The girl, surprisingly enough, but the disagreement among the kin about her unusual name did not pay any attention, and to all appearances, inconvenience did not experience. She quite calmly and equally reacted to the demonstrative Brandy, which her mother insisted on, to the simpler to the world and to glory, which constantly slipped in the address of grandfathers, aunts, and other people. As for the not-so-logical address Marisa, that was Grandpa's prerogative. Only he called her that. And there was something special, mysterious about it, as if there was a secret between grandfather and granddaughter that was not available to others, and they were not going to reveal it to anyone. Why Marisa? Every now and then asked someone who had heard the grandfather address the girl for the first time, because they both answered in a meaningful chorus. Brandy made a mysterious face, and Grandpa winked, hiding a smile. As the girl grew older, it became clear to everyone that she would be, if not as beautiful as her mother, then at least very much like Piper. Family, as they were called in the city, narrow gray eyes, lush blonde hair were clearly her mother's. But the lean, easygoing figure was a reminder of John, who wasn't meant to see his daughter. Brandy adored her grandfather, and anyone who saw the two of them could tell at a glance that it was mutual. John, who had disappeared into the woods for years and had been devastated when his own children were growing up, now took care of his granddaughter 24 hours a day. Despite Piper's protests, he rode her as a toddler on his fearsome-looking dogs, with whom he still went hunting on occasion. They painted themselves from top to toe with green for company with his granddaughter. When he picked up a wound, he would trot early in the morning to the neighbor's house for fresh milk. He proudly took Brandy, holding her hand, to first grade. When Brandy became seriously ill with the flu for the first time in her life, John literally went down with her. He couldn't eat or drink, sitting below, appearing at the door of Brandy's room, and listening to the ragged breathing of the sleeping girl. And when her temperature suddenly spiked, he turned so pale that Piper was seriously afraid for him, deciding who needed help first, daughter or father. When the girl grew up, she enthusiastically involved in the study of the forest, spending all vacations with her grandfather in his woodsman's old house. Laughing in the settlement, poor Brandy. How does she get along with that old scientist there? Look, Piper warned the neighbors. The girls lost her conversational skills. Everyone would be very surprised to learn that John and Brandy talked not just a lot, but a lot, and even got a little bored with each other and arguing about something to the point of hoarseness. Both stubborn and unyielding. They were willing to defend their point of view to the last man. On her first visit to her grandfather's forest dwelling, the girl was amazed to find that almost an entire wall of the old hut is occupied by shelves densely packed with books and magazines. "And you read all this?" the girl asked in amazement, running her finger along the book spines. "Well, let's put it this way," John smirked. "Here's Dickens, for instance. What are they?" "Well, tell me the title." "Empty Hopes." High Hopes. Brandy laughed at the word. "So started reading 10 pages, got through, and that was it. Can't go any further." Falling asleep, John admitted. Yeah, right. The girl rejoiced. That's right, and it's exactly the same with me. Imagine I say to our teacher, Irina Viktorovna, it's impossible to read. And she said to me, well, then 2 for the quarter. Can you imagine I had to read? And only agonized like. Hello, here we are. War and peace, said John. Well, you're wrong. Don't you dare speak ill of that work. I'm not a literary critic. I don't even get to discuss books like that. Yes, he continued. Well, tell me then, if you are such a connoisseur of literature, why does Tolstoy write half the book in French? And then the same thing is repeated in Russian. Why is that? Did they forget to ask you? John put his hands out expressively in front of him and shook his fists. To convey the spirit of the times, he answered himself. I think it's to make the book thicker and sell more, Brandy said snidely. Oh, you, John exclaimed. But you, Brandy, are quite choked up with resentment for the great Russian writer. Such arguments occurred to them regularly and ended, as a rule, in a draw. Each remained in his own opinion, although he thought about his opponent's position. John did this especially often. Brandy's a smart girl, after all, he chuckled. I listen to her, but she's talking nonsense. And then I start thinking, and it turns out she's not so wrong. Often they would just sit on the porch of the old forest cabin, and as John said, listen to the woods. Say, Grandpa, don't you ever get bored out here? I mean, you've lived here alone for weeks on end, haven't you? The girl asked. But why not? He grinned. It has happened, so seized, that with the wolves in one voice howled. I've had all sorts of things, but not enough to run to town. My forest is better than any city. I love it. Is it true that you were born in Moscow? She asked a question that had long interested her. True, he nodded. Only it was so long ago that it doesn't seem true anymore. And it doesn't exist anymore, my Moscow. It's quite different. I should very much like to see it. I wish I could go, said the girl dreamily. Well, why, and will you go? John said. When you get a little older, I'll send you to meet your grandmother. What grandmother? Brandy marveled. Yours. But hell, I've never been good at these names. Who's who to whom? Who's who? Probably your great-grandmother. Who's she to you? Anyway, my own sister Zinaida. She still lives in Moscow. We haven't seen each other for 15 years, but I write letters regularly. She answers. I call her to visit. And she calls me to her. Yes, I guess it's not fate anymore. But you'll go by all means, John said. Brandy looked at the man in surprise. Well, where? Wow, he has a sister in Moscow. Why did you leave Moscow? Yeah, I think the right question to ask is why was I born there? John grinned. I'm not a city person, I guess. And it all worked out that way. Zina grew up, she had a family. I put them in our parents' apartment. Everyone died in the war. It was just the 2 of us. I graduated from the institute, got a distribution, and came here. You studied at an institute in Moscow? Brandy asked in surprise. Tonight was clearly a night of discovery, she continued. John grinned again. I'm not as much of a hermit as everyone thinks. I'm actually the terribly educated type. I'll show you all around here yet. The girl listened to her grandfather with her mouth open. She heard about her grandmother from Moscow one more time, when the grandfather suddenly, to the amazement of the whole village, quickly packed up and left for the city. From there, he left by airplane. To Aunt Zina, Papa's sister. Her husband died, Piper quietly explained to her daughter. John returned a month later, scowling and particularly taciturn. As had been his habit for years, he had gone off alone for a few days in the taiga. Brandy realized that this was her grandfather's way of muffling his sadness, that the forest helped him through his grief. Brandy's school years flew by. During this time, Piper had 3 more grandchildren, and of course all of them he loved, brought up and tried to make men. But his firstborn granddaughter, his adored little girl, Brandy, forever held a special place in his heart. After high school, Brandy decided to go to the city to enroll in a teacher training institute. "I'll get my degree and come home. I'm going to work as a teacher at my dad's school," she explained to her family. The memory of her father, whom she never saw, the girl carefully kept in her heart. The words "dad's school" decided everything. The evening before they left, Brandy and John sat side by side on a huge rock which, warmed by the day's sun, stood like a lonely guardian over the river cliff. They sat there in silence. The girl thought with joyful excitement about tomorrow and about the new, completely different life that would begin for her very soon. John pondered anxiously. He would feel much safer if Brandy, for example, went into the woods alone, into the middle of nowhere. The city, where he hadn't traveled out of the settlement in years, was firmly associated with the jungle, far more dangerous than the usual taiga. The dangers that lurked there for his little girl were more serious than bears and ticks. Brandy, he finally broke the silence and took his granddaughter's hand. "You know, I'm not a big expert on life. There's a reason I'm nicknamed that, but I still remember some things. I want to tell you something. Many years ago, my father said, and I've lived by those rules all my life, and they've gotten me through many times." Brandy listened to her grandfather very carefully. He had never spoken to her in such a tone before, solemn and a little sad at the same time. "There are 7 commandments, Brandy, just 7. They're simple and very human, sort of. Don't believe, don't be afraid, don't ask, don't cry, don't wait, don't fuss, don't hope. That's it. I even wrote them on a piece of paper so you wouldn't forget them." He thrust a piece of checkered paper into her hand. She looked at it, moving her lips, reading what was written, turned her gaze to the river, behind which the June sun was sinking, and thought for a long time. "Look, well, don't ask, don't be afraid, don't cry, I understand. The don't mess around is understandable too. But what about don't believe, don't hope? So believe only in yourself, and hope only in yourself. It'll be easier that way. And you, what are you, grandfather? What are you teaching me? Am I not supposed to trust even you? And can't I hope in you or something?" John lowered his head and said, "I will always be there for you. No matter how far away I am in doing so, remember that. But what I told you is also firmly planted in everyone's head. This conversation is over. Let's go home and let your mother decide before I do." Brandy went to the big city of New York and enrolled in teacher training school. Despite the fact that she came from a small village, she quickly adapted to the city and student life. Cheerful, well-read, not going for a word in her pocket. The girl successfully mastered the educational program because appearance, no matter what they say, plays a very important role. She was also doing well, and the rare, unusual name invariably drew attention to her. "What's your name?" her peers, her professors, her dorm neighbors regularly asked. Brandy would say her name proudly and jokingly add, remembering her mom. "And I'll ask you not to cut it short. I'm warning you, I'm not saying no." Great Brandy finally went to New York City after her sophomore year. Zina Sergeyevna, Uncle John's younger sister, welcomed Brandy with open arms. The girl entered the cool twilight of a huge apartment with ceilings of unprecedented height. She found herself in the unexpectedly tight embrace of a short, thin woman with a kind face on which John's eyes shone. a native New Yorker. She had lived in her hometown all her life, loved and knew it inside and out. Zena, like most children, in that terrible, but still in its own way happy time, remembered nothing. She had no one except her brother. John essentially raised her. In the early 50s, she married a young and hopeful student. However, Zena did not know about any hopes and just fell in love head over heels, as brother John put it. A few years later, it turned out that James, that was her husband's name, a very talented physicist, engaged in atomic energy. This branch of science was on an unprecedented rise. The Institute of Atomic Energy was founded. James, along with other young scientists, worked in it under the guidance of academician Kurchatov himself. The work was, of course, of national importance, and most of the top secret. Even his favorite wife, Jane James, could not tell what he was doing, and it was not really necessary. "I still do not understand anything, James," she laughed merrily, cheerfully tapping her fingers on the keys of the typewriter. Jane herself, having finished 9 classes and courses, worked as a typist in a New York institute, loved her husband, and was perfectly happy. John by that time had graduated from the Institute of Forestry Technology, or, as it was simply called, forestry, and went to work somewhere very far away, several thousand kilometers away in the taiga. For the first few years he'd come to his hometown to see them, rejoiced to see his sister, marveled at James's success, bought bags full of gifts for his own, and disappeared again for years. Then he finally settled down in the middle of nowhere, got married. Zena couldn't stand it, took a vacation and flew to his wedding. John was exactly as she remembered him, only even stronger, mightier, with a beard like Elia Muramat's, all soaked in the smell of pine and smoke, which seemed to be absorbed into his skin and hair forever. He picked his sister up in his arms, hugging her as he had once done in their distant childhood. Then John had children one by one. He and Zena wrote letters to each other, sent pictures. But of course it wasn't the same. James made very great strides in science. For 15 years he went from graduate student to professor, received several government awards. The young family moved several times, and each time the apartment was larger and more luxurious than the previous one. Finally, in the mid-60s, James got a huge 4-room apartment in the center of the city, on the Hudson River waterfront. Zena timidly entered the hallway, which alone was probably the size of half of their previous dwelling, and looked fearfully at her reflection in the huge full-length mirror. "Do you hear that?" For some reason she asked in a whisper. "Why do we need so many rooms?" "What do you mean why?" James smiled, hugging his little frightened wife. "One room will go for my office. I am some kind of scientist after all. The other will be yours. And you'll stop nagging that I'm always mixing your books and mine. And you have to read a physics textbook instead of a love story." He laughed. "The third room is the living room, the fourth." He faltered and coughed. The fourth would be the nursery, but still. Amber gently released herself from her husband's embrace. She walked to the mirror and thoughtfully drew a funny face with her finger on the dusty surface of the glass. It was a difficult conversation for both of them. Despite their best efforts and passionate desire to have children, or at least one child, nothing had worked so far. Was there something wrong with Amber, or was the cause James, who, having spent many years in science, could have and surely had received some radiation doses, or been exposed to some other little studied and therefore safe exposure? Who knows? The result was the same. They had no children. "Nursery," Amber said, as if listening to the sound of the word. "Who's the nursery for?" "James." She grinned bitterly at her reflection in the mirror and shook her head. "You know, I got a letter from John. He's already had his fourth child. He's got 2 girls and 2 boys. It's just that I guess John got all the fertility in our family. And I have nothing left, she joked sadly. Don't be so upset. James came over to her and took her hand. We still have a lot of time ahead of us. You know, I have an idea. I'll take a vacation this summer, and we'll go to John's place. Maybe the place is so generous with kids there. Why? I think it's a great idea. We're not going anywhere, because of course you're not taking any vacation. I've heard that many times, Amber said cheerfully. Still, they loved each other very much and were happy. Until James died. Once again, John had saved him, helped him out, lent his shoulder and his hands. Sitting by James's coffin, Amber, blind with tears, looked up, saw John, who had come from nowhere, and immediately felt lighter, brighter, and a little less painful. She wasn't alone anymore. John had been with her for a month. He sat by her bedside, calmed her tantrums, wiped her tears, made her eat, changed the compresses on her head, read books aloud to her, took her for walks, leading her by the hand like a little girl. For some reason, she could not stop crying and constantly tried to complain about her fate. I am afraid, what will I do now? How to live? I don't know how to live without James. Oh, Amber, you've forgotten all that. You've broken all our commandments. I taught you once, remember? Did you? Let's do it again. Don't cry. Don't be afraid. Don't ask. Stop crying. Stop crying. Drink some water. Well done. And calm down. Wipe your nose. All right, Amber. Finally, in the morning when she opened her eyes, she got out of bed, washed her face with cold water, and knocked. She went into the next room, where her brother was snoozing awkwardly, curled up on a sofa too short for him. John, she said, kissing him on the cheek. Thank you. I'm all right now, aren't I? You should go home to your kids, to your forest. You go. Just write to me, please. Please write to me. Amber was alone in her huge professor's apartment with a small but very serious, according to experts, collection of paintings, library and letters of her brother from distant Siberia. When John suddenly called, she was even frightened. Was something wrong? She knew well his dislike of telephone conversations. Well, it's nothing. Some conversation, he grumbled. You can't see a person's eyes. What are you saying? You don't think. We're just talking nonsense. Just to pass out quickly. He wrote letters with an old-fashioned, thorough thread. Long and interesting, carefully considered, written in the wonderfully smooth, beautiful handwriting of Brother John's letters. It was a miracle for his huge hands. Amber looked forward to them with great impatience, and when she received them, she always made a ritual of reading them. She didn't tear open the envelope on the fly or run her eyes over the lines of the letter as she walked up the stairs to the apartment door, as she usually did when she received a long-awaited message. No, she brewed her favorite tea, poured it into an elegant porcelain mug, and sat down at the small table that James, knowing his wife's habits, jokingly called the writer's table, with an antique silver paper cutting knife. She carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the tightly written pages. After reading her brother's messages, Amber leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. It seemed to her that for a while she was transported there, many hundreds of miles away, and saw John, his graceful, inexplicably kept slim after so many children, his wife Nancy, his noisy and cheerful nephews. A large, cozy, hospitable house, and a dark green wall of forest rising beyond the edge of the village. And suddenly a call from John. "What's wrong?" Amber asked immediately. She still couldn't forgive herself for not going to the funeral of Nancy, her brother's wife, because then she'd left everything behind when James was gone. He flew in and spent a month comforting her in her grief. "Hello, Amber." "Nothing's wrong," he reassured her. "I just called to check on you. I have a favor to ask." "What kind of request?" Zenaida gasped, for the first time in her life hearing from her brother this word. "Yes, Amber. That's what it is. So Brandy, my granddaughter, Brandy." He pronounced his granddaughter's name a little awkwardly. "She's really excited about New York, seeing the capital. Will you come?" "Oh my God, of course, John. I'd be so happy." Amber was so excited she almost dropped her phone. "Anytime, maybe you'll come, John. I'd love to see you." "I miss you too, Brandy." John's voice trembled. "I guess I'll never get around to it. Piper." "Jesus Christ, Brandy. It's coming in on the 20th, so meet me in New York." Brandy, as usual, was stunned and amazed. Sure, she'd spent the last 2 years in the city, but compared to the capital, it seemed as small a town as the one she'd been born in. "What do you want to see in New York?" Amber asked, sitting the pink-haired girl down at the kitchen table and putting a steaming bowl of borscht in front of her. "Everything," she declared. "Well, then you need to quit the institute and move in with me for a year and a half," laughed the woman. "Let's do it this way. You and I have a week. Every day we'll devote to one serious attraction. Well, for example, the Metropolitan Opera or the Museum of Modern Art. I'll show you the city in between. You eat, honey, eat. New York doesn't like hungry people." "Are you kidding? It's a shame to waste time eating. There's so much I want to do." Brandy looked at Amber carefully. "You were raised by John, right? Then you must know his famous commandments. What family's granddaughter are you violating right now?" "Stay out." Brandy exhaled. "There," laughed the woman. "Good for you." When the first wave of excitement subsided, Brandy, under Amber's guidance, began to explore New York City carefully and thoughtfully. The woman showed her hometown with love and pride, and it was a very different New York. It wasn't the bustling, parade-like New York that millions of tourists imagine it to be, but old, stately, and beautiful in its own special way. Brandy was thrilled, and Amber watched the girl with amusement. Wow, John's granddaughter. What an amazing mix of her grandfather's features and some other blood in her. Probably her father, that boy who died so tragically and ridiculously. Oh yeah, her mom Piper, of course. She looks a lot like John. And how beautiful she was when she was young. I remember that James, having seen a picture of Piper, said that with such a look should not live in a Siberian village and on the modeling runway, especially now Russian beauty is again, as they say, in fashion. Of course, the daughter is not as beautiful as her mother, but still a charming girl. And what a wonderful character. Cheerful and at the same time attentive, thoughtful. Always has her own opinion, but so great able to listen and so sensitive to the beautiful. At the ballet Giselle, which they saw at the Metropolitan Opera House, at intermission Brandy became suspiciously quiet. "Brandy, hurry up and get up. Come on, while we take a break, I'll show you the circular hall, the so-called Little Imperial Foyer. You know, the acoustics in there are amazing. If you whisper something, the walls and ceiling will amplify it 100 times over. Your grandfather once told me that he had imperial foyers like that in the woods along the river, where the rocks stick out." She laughed and stopped when she saw that the girl hadn't moved. "Brandy, what's wrong?" She sat down next to her and noticed that her eyes were red. "Nothing," Brandy said quietly. "It's awful. This ballet of yours. Why is everything so beautiful and sad? Why did she have to die? You mean Giselle? Amber finally figured it out. Oh girl, I'm so sorry, you old fool. I didn't realize you were so worried. Frankly speaking, Amber didn't suspect such sensitivity in a Siberian girl who grew up in a small southern village. After all, judging by her stories, she had grown up in a simple environment, without any frills. She'd spent a lot of time in the woods, and she didn't look like a graduate of a boarding school for noble maidens. From that point on, Brandy became even more interesting to watch. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she quietly walked from one world-famous painting to another and sighed softly. "What's up?" Amber asked when they returned home and sat in the large, cozy kitchen, drinking tea and putting another New York day in their heads. Amazing, Brandy exhaled. "Only everything in my head is all mixed up. You know, Amber, if I had many lives, I'd spend one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and see one painting a day." No, it's not like that. One painting a day for 3 days. I'd look at it and then I'd leave. You see, I think that's the only way to really look at and understand a painting. I mean, some people it's easy. Well, she didn't really have the words. I didn't particularly like Ayvazovsky. When I was looking at the 9th shaft, I thought for a second that I was about to drown. They laughed merrily. "I must seem like a provincial fool to you," Brandy asked. "No, girl, you're not stupid, you're smart." Amber smiled. "And you're also my John's child." "Well, maybe a granddaughter, but still, grandchildren are our children too." She suddenly stopped talking and then continued. "You look just like him, don't you? And just like him, you know how to surprise. Do you love your grandfather very much?" "Yes?" Brandy asked. "You mean your brother?" "Very much." Amber answered and sat down on the soft corner sofa. "I mean, John is the only person I have in the whole world. When he and I were left alone after the war, he basically replaced my parents. If it wasn't for him, I could have starved to death. There's a 100% chance I would have ended up in an orphanage. John wouldn't let me go. I remember yelling at the police officers so much that I was afraid they'd turn him in. He went to work to feed me. He wasn't even 14 yet. He lied desperately to get hired, adding his age. They believed him, of course, because he was already 2 heads taller than his peers, and healthy. It's even surprising how he grew up to be such a rich man. After all, we were living on nothing, and he tried to cram an extra piece into me. And they weren't extra pieces, they were his pieces. I only realized that later when I was older." Amber, as if lost in herself, was suddenly silent. "Are you sitting in a chair?" Brandy looked at her. "Well, naturally you don't know that." "Yes," the woman grinned. "John didn't tell you that he'd been working 8 to 10 hours a day since he was 13, and then he'd come home at night, sleep for 3 hours, and run to school. And how I put another dependent around his neck. Like I wasn't enough for him. You don't know either?" Amber smiled. "I married James. And they literally had nothing but a suitcase of books and a lot of love. James was a student. I was taking classes. John put the 2 of us on his back. For almost 3 years we lived on his money, and he gave us his parents' apartment and moved into some doghouse. He said that newlyweds shouldn't have anyone crawling around. You know, I took it all for granted back then. And then, as an adult, I realized if it wasn't for John, I might not even be alive. And even if I had, I don't know how my fate would have turned out. I owe everything in my life to my brother." Amber was silent again, for a long time. Brandy also sat quietly like a mouse, thinking where. Wow, he didn't even have a childhood. First the war, then a little sister in his arms. Working alongside adults is a real feat. That's how it really was. All she'd heard him say a couple times was, well, he was born in New York. Went to college. Got a sister, Amber. She grew up, I moved away, and that was it. Self. Then all of a sudden she conquered herself. Brandy for once really questioned him about how he used to live. Maybe he'd like to tell it all, but he'd never talk about it himself. He'd say it's nonsense. It's not a feat. It's just normal. Now you tell me, how do you live there? Amber changed the subject abruptly. We live well, Brandy smiled. She told her grandmother a long time about their house, her family, about her trips to the woods with her grandfather. Suddenly she realized that she missed her very much. The week in New York flew by. Brandy and Amber had become good friends. You come visit me, girl Amber said, wiping away her tears. Anytime you want to come, you hear me? I feel so good with you. Like it's not just you, but John here with me. And you better pack up and fly to us. No, really, Amber. Brandy's dressed. How happy he'll be. What Amber laughed. Maybe I'll fly over, what the heck. The next summer, Amber did make up her mind and came to visit. A shocked John treated his sister like a valuable crystal vase. He fumbled around the house for a long time, not knowing where to put Amber. He rejected one room because the light from the window was too bright, the other because it was too dark. The third room would be noisy because someone would be up at the crack of dawn. So he took away her suitcase and put her in one of the rooms overlooking the river, which she was perfectly happy with. Amber was surprisingly happy here. Who were all these people? She'd seen them all but John and Brandy for the first time in her life, except for the pictures her brother had sent her. But somehow they all seemed like family. The still very beautiful Piper. Her brother's broad-shouldered and gray-eyed looked a lot like John. Her second niece, Jane, in contrast to Piper's skinny, their children. They were all somehow terribly related, as if she'd known them all her life. As if everything that had happened to them, and that she knew about from John's letters, she had lived with them. And the New York professor, by all accounts, was not at all what they had imagined her to be. Instead of the haughty metropolitan snootiness, there was a simple, kind sister-in-law who quickly changed into her simple outfits and immediately joined in the cooking. She laughed merrily at unpretentious jokes. Dashingly, laughingly wrinkling her nose, she clapped her hands several times. Then she supported the singing chorus with her soft but very beautiful voice. They recognized her as their own completely, and finally, after she threw off her shoes and ran barefoot to the vegetable garden to get cucumbers for a snack. And then she did something that was not at all expected from a New York professor with an embarrassed ounce. She promptly jumped up from the bench and rushed in the direction of the street toilet. Our girl, one of the men, summarized, after spending several days in a continuous feast with relatives, acquaintances, and family friends eager to meet the New Yorker. Amber, feeling like she was about to burst from what she had eaten and drank, requested, "Take me into your forest, John," she asked. "I've heard so much about it from Brandy. I want to see your old lady book for myself. In fact, I want to see how you've lived all these years. Hidden cook. You'll get mosquitoes all over you. Mary and I are used to it, but I'm afraid you can't stand it," said John hesitatingly. "I'll bear it. Please." Amber begged. In the evening, they sat on the porch of the woodsman's cabin as usual. Only now there were 3 of them, and they listened to the woods. Before Amber left, the whole family sat around the table where all of John's children with their wives, husbands, and their children fit. At the head of the table were John and his sister, who even now, during the meal, touched each other every now and then. She put her hand under his, resting her shoulder against John's for a few seconds, then quietly touching his cheek. It was as if she was trying to use every moment to savor their closeness, the opportunity to see and hear the dear one. The generous table was set with everything that was imaginable and possible. The family was especially proud of their own apples grown on their homestead. No one around here has apples like Brandy's, the villagers readily admitted. Hell knows what they water with. They're the only ones with apples like that for some reason. The summer Amber came to visit. The apple crop had been especially bountiful. On the table, of course, was a platter of large, ruddy fruit. The woman, listening to one of her nephews, nodding her head, picked up an apple and brought it up to her face. Suddenly she froze, looked at her brother and giggled with a quiet laugh. Everyone looked at her in surprise. "You remember, don't you? We should." "Oh, I can't. We'd like some apples. An apple." She said something completely incomprehensible because she couldn't stop laughing, holding her side and swallowing the words. John looked at Amber in surprise, as if remembering something. Suddenly, obviously remembering, he smiled, waved his hand, and shook his whole body, laughing with his sister. "I remembered too," he said, and seeing the surprise of his relatives, waved his hand. "Yes, it's silly and nothing funny." "So Dad, tell me," Piper exclaimed. All those present joined her, demanding a story. "What's there to tell?" "Well, anyway, they were young, just married and moved into our apartment. I was working at the station, unloading wagons. So we've been loading apples for a week, so I pocketed a few for my students." "You stole them?" enthusiastically asked Peter, the eldest son with an almost completely gray head. "Expropriate," said the father sternly. "Not, by the way, the hope of the Soviet nuclear industry had to be fed. So one day I bring them apples, 2 days I bring them apples, 3 they clap, only the noise is worth." They ate everything indiscriminately. Sometimes I even thought they didn't notice what they were eating. Even an apple or an old stick, they'd eat it all up in no time. And on the 4th day, I forgot to take the apples. I forgot. That's all, I was too busy. So I came home and sat down to dinner. They, my students, are sitting next to me, studying books, as usual. I ate. They were silent. I did something. I walk around, smoke. They don't talk. So I went to bed. And then they raise their heads and say, "John, we'd like some apples." "That's ridiculous," I said. "It's not funny," said John, watching the whole family laughing. "You're a lucky man," John Amber said to him. "And I'm a lucky woman now, too." She kissed her brother on the cheek and felt the thread in the seam of his sleeve crack from his embrace. Brother and sister never saw each other again. Brandy was in her 4th year at the Institute of Money her mother and grandfather sent regularly. She had enough at first, especially since, over and above the agreed amount, John would periodically send her Mary more, as he said, a little something saved for smoke secretly from Piper. But appetite, as we know, comes at mealtime. And soon Brandy, having had a taste of city life, began to miss help from his family. And labor experience is never too much for anyone. So having passed the session, she did not return home, as she usually did, but went to work as a counselor at a summer camp. The job was difficult, hectic, but fun. After one particularly difficult day that had worn her nerves out, Brandy, as a counselor, was given a few days off during her shift. She decided to take advantage of the opportunity and get some rest. But she didn't go into town. She needed a different kind of vacation, a very special kind of vacation, the kind that Grandpa John had taught her to take. She missed the woods and the city. She hadn't realized this until she had lived city life for a couple of years. Now she understood perfectly well what was the point of John's periodic absences, as they were called in the family, when he went alone into the taiga and returned sometimes after 2 or even 3 weeks. It was so great to get somewhere far away, where there were no people, cars, buildings, asphalt. Nothing but tall, slender, like ships' masts, pine trunks stretching into the sky. How pleasant it was to feel under my feet not the rough hardness of the floor or asphalt, but soft springs, and with every step a carpet of thousands of layers of pine needles. Silence. The forest, after the endless noise and clatter of the city, at first fell on my ears as if they were plugged with absorbent cotton, and then gradually the sounds of wind birds, the creaking of branches and the rustling of leaves in the forest began to enter my head. My head became delightfully empty and light. Everything bad seemed to dissolve into the fresh, pine-scented air. Brandy wasn't afraid to get lost. She had grown up under her grandfather's guidance in the taiga on a plot of several dozen acres, able to find her way in the dark by signs and markings that only she could see. But it would be hard for her to get lost here, even if she wanted to. So she simply walked without thinking about the direction, without any purpose, immersed in the atmosphere of the forest, as only those who truly love and understand nature can do. That there were people ahead, she realized long before she saw them. The place was a tourist destination, and she was not surprised to see people here. She only grumbled unhappily and wondered what to do next. The forest was clearly down to the river, and she planned to go down to the bank, bypass the large ravine, and go upstream. From the sounds of it, the campers were positioned exactly in her path. She didn't want to go around the ravine. It was filled with old fallen tree trunks and was hardly passable even for her. There was only one way past the tourists. Brandy adjusted her backpack and strode determinedly toward the river. Her hunch was correct. The forest ended at a small cliff, and between it and the river was a cozy clearing, covered with smooth, emerald grass that looked like a perfect lawn. 2 cars were parked a little to the side. Several large, colorful cloths were lying on the grass, and in the middle of the clearing was a pile of piled things. A few people, like ants, were dragging individual items from this pile, sometimes bringing them back, taking something else, throwing them along the road. It all looked ridiculous and rather goofy. Urban Brandy concluded unmistakably. Leaning against a pine tree and watching the hustle and bustle of tourists for a break, she stepped into the clearing. "Hello," she said loudly. There was an inaudible response. Judging by their faces, the people were not happy about something, and in general looked little like carefree young people who went on vacation in a pleasant company. "Hello, girl." She heard a normal human greeting behind her. Brandy looked back. Standing in front of her was a tall, broad-shouldered, and strong guy with dark hair. He was holding a cell phone in his hands, with his arm outstretched in front of him for some reason. "Excuse me, do you have internet?" he asked. "So you catch the internet?" She guessed the reason for the strange pose. "Well, what kind of internet can there be here? It's in the middle of nowhere, and it's blocked by a cliff and a rock. You have to climb to the top over there, and there might be internet there. You know what I mean? Why do you need internet in the wilderness? We got a new tent, but no instructions. We've already argued with each other, but still we can't figure it out. I want to go home." He smiled embarrassedly and spread his hands. "Idiocy. Fuck it all. And all of you and your camping," came from the clearing. Judging by the expressions, Another attempt to pitch a tent had failed again. Brandy smirked. "It's not going to work. I can see from here that you're trying to put it up inside out." She shrugged. "In fact, all tents are set up the same way, and you don't need instructions, and you picked the wrong spot. Too close to the river, you'll freeze at night. Come on, I'll help you." In a few minutes, a large, brightly colored tent was set up in the middle of the clearing, and the tent was stretched. While they were setting up the tent, Brandy learned that the group of 3 guys and 2 girls had indeed come from the city. As urban natives, they had a more theoretical idea of outdoor recreation. It seemed to them that everything was very easy and simple. A modern, expensive tent will literally unfold itself on the clearing. The fire will burst out cheerfully, and they themselves will only have to fry a tasty kebab and sing songs. In fact, everything turned out to be quite different. And during the time of camping, they managed to fight a lot. "Thank you very much." The dark-haired guy smiled broadly and held out his hand to Brandy. "We wouldn't have gotten the tent up without you." Fred, one of the girls, interrupted their conversation with a cranky voice. "Who's going to make the fire? What are we going to make it out of? We've forgotten how we forgot the firewood." The boy's face showed such panic that Brandy couldn't stand it and burst out laughing. "So we forgot," she shrugged. "What are we going to do now?" He looked around at his friends in confusion. By the look on their faces, they all shared his concerns. "What's wrong with you guys?" Brandy couldn't take it anymore. "Who comes into the woods for firewood anyway? Over there," she waved her hand toward the woods. "There's a huge ravine full of wood. You can get it from there." "What's the problem?" The boys looked at each other uncertainly and moved in the direction the girl had indicated. Brandy sat down on a large rock and began to carefully develop her sneakers. She was just finishing up when the grieving campers returned with firewood. They brought, of course, in her observation, utter nonsense. 2 of them had bundles of very thin twigs that burned in a few minutes. The third, the one who'd been talking to Brandy, was huffing and puffing and struggling to drag a huge old apricot, which was unlikely to have anything for the fire. "Guys, this isn't the same." She sighed, feeling like a kindergarten teacher. "Come on, I'll show you." With her guidance, they brought in and piled up wood suitable for the fire. Brandy herself brought in more than any of the boys. This, and this need chopping. She tossed aside several large pieces of wood. At the word chop, the young men looked at each other fearfully. "Let's get the axe." Brandy offered to help. "We'll take it from here, boys," she said, as the flames danced merrily over the wood stacked in the fire. The girls, who had been standing on the sidelines and ostentatiously looking at their manicures, rushed to thank their benefactor Brandy. "We'd be lost without you," the dark-haired guy said with a smile. Yeah, obviously it was coming to that. She nodded and slung her backpack behind her back. "Well, have a good vacation. And please, when you leave, take your trash with you." "Wait, you've been so helpful. We don't even know your name," the guy stalled. "My name is very plain and simple." Brandy, the girl, decided to make one last joke. "Brandy," the boy repeated in surprise, but to her surprise, he didn't say the usual stupid as in backwards. He said something original, you know. "It's no wonder you have such an unusual name. You're a remarkable girl yourself. You're like some kind of forest fairy." "We don't have fairies in our forest." She felt that she was enjoying talking to this guy. And yeah, he was pretty cute too. "It's more Leslie." "But you can't be Leslie's girl already," he smiled. "I'm Leslie's granddaughter," she said jokingly. "Emily," he said her name with pleasure. "Perhaps you'd like to join us for dinner. It's the least we can do to thank you for your help." My name is Fred, by the way." She'd been wandering the woods all day and was certainly hungry. The prospect of eating fresh hot meat certainly appealed more than the dinner of canned gruel in her backpack. Fred's friends, realizing that, although their vacation had gotten off to a bad start, things had suddenly and magically gotten better, rushed over to invite Brandy to be their guest. She realized from their conversations around the fire that they came from the same city where she had studied, New York. They were students too, except for Fred, who was a little older and had already graduated. There were 2 couples in the company, and Fred had come alone. The usual majors, Brandy thought to herself as she looked at the large, obviously expensive SUVs, expensive brand-name clothes, and a lot of inappropriately selected items intended for outdoor activities. But in reality, in Brandy's opinion, they were a complete waste of money. It was clear from the guys' conversations, which mostly revolved around acquaintances and their financial opportunities, that the company's interests were quite specific and limited. Fred was the exception here. He tried to keep Brandy entertained and genuinely admired the fact that she could make witty jokes and act cute. Embarrassed himself for his touristy unfitness. "Well, I guess I should get going," Emily said, looking at the setting sun and calculating the distance to the campground. "Where to?" "Into the woods at night?" Fred asked jokingly. "No, thank you. I have to go." Brandy stood up resolutely and reached for her backpack. "It was great to meet you. Have a good rest of the day," she shouted loudly to the whole group. "Well then, at least let me walk you out." Fred also got up after the girl. "I don't think that's a good idea," Brandy laughed. "As I've already realized, you're not very good tourists. And I'm afraid that after you walk me out, I'll have to walk you back to camp, and then I'll be late. So bye, and good luck." She put on the straps of her backpack and took a step towards the woods. "Wait, Brandy, please." Fred looked at her helplessly and pitifully. "You mean you're just going to walk away and I'll never see you again?" I wish I could. Brandy realized she was starting to flirt with him. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't help it. "Do you like Fred?" she asked. "Yes, very much." He looked at Brandy with genuine admiration and smiled. "Well, if you really want to, then you'll find me. All witches or wizards go to the Institute of International Relations. Didn't you know that?" Brandy laughed, pleased with her joke, waved him off, and walked toward the woods, feeling his gaze on her back. And the shift at camp was over. Brandy returned to the city. A few days later, she started classes at the Institute, entering her 5th year. There were crucial sessions and work on her diploma ahead. It all came at once with such force that she almost forgot about her adventure in the woods and her acquaintance with a young man named Fred. She had been very surprised indeed when one day, as she walked down the stairs in the foyer, she saw his tall figure and dark hair. He waved at her and smiled. "Hi, Brandy," he said as he approached, and she suddenly felt very pleased with the way he said her name. Fred said it softly, gently, carefully, as if he enjoyed saying it himself. "So I found you. Why?" she asked him bluntly. He was clearly embarrassed by such directness, blushed a little, and, stumbling a little, answered, "Because I really wanted to. All this time since that meeting in the woods, I've been thinking about you all the time. I like you a lot, Brandy. And if it's possible, I'd like to take you out for, well, a walk, a chat." "Okay, I'll do that," she replied simply. The Smith family was celebrating the 25th birthday of their only son, Fred. At the table, in addition to the birthday boy's father, Andrew, and Mom, Jane, sat several people who were considered close family friends. These people had been handpicked and vetted over the years. Jane carefully controlled her family's circle of acquaintances so that, God forbid, someone random and unsuitable would not be included. There was never any serious money in the family. Andrew, for many years, held a rather promising position as head of a small trucking company. In matters of personal enrichment, Jane was a complete profane. Jane Ivanovna herself, of course, had some opportunities, working as chief accountant of a small joint venture. But the money she earned by all means could not satisfy her appetite. There was only one hope for Fred. The boy grew up quite smart, handsome, and athletic. Jane struggled to provide her son with everything he needed. Since the 7th grade, by Jane's decision, he went to school with a claim to some elitism. This should, in the opinion of his mother, to provide a guy the right circle of socialization, which she dreamed of. By the end of school, it finally became clear that Fred had no special talents and abilities. With the right friends from the mother's point of view, too, there was a failure. Children of wealthy parents left for further studies in the capital and foreign colleges. Fred went to the most ordinary university, got a diploma in management, and went to work in some trading company as an ordinary employee with an ordinary salary. Of course, this was not at all what Jane had dreamed of for her son. Finally, 2 years after Fred graduated from the institute, hope flashed. Jane met a woman who turned out to be the wife of a very wealthy man. As Jane got closer to her new friend, she became convinced that her financial and property situation was really quite substantial. This was evidenced by the chauffeur-driven car in which Svetlana, as the acquaintance was called, drove around the city of New York. A huge, rather tasteless, but luxurious in terms of equipment and furnishings of the mansion, where Jane was soon invited to tea. But the greatest value of the new acquaintance in Jane Ivanovna's eyes was that Svetlana had a daughter. The maiden was a year and a half older than Fred, but looked all of 30 years old by nature. Not possessing anything outstanding, she was already fully acquainted with the achievements of plastic surgery. But in her case, unfortunately, it did not add much to her beauty. But the matter was not even in the natural data. The girl, whose name was Alina, was characterized by a bad character, to which her parents had a hand. She was spoiled, capricious, petty, and frankly stupid. Pick up such a treasure, despite the money of his father, willing to find yet not found. And the girl frankly gave her parents a lot of trouble and worry. Jane realized all this quite quickly just by getting acquainted and talking to Alina. Still, in her opinion, this was Fred's chance to make a name for himself, especially since both Aileen's father and mother were in favor and guaranteed the future young family all kinds of support. A meeting of the young people was arranged soon. Fred, from it, as expected, ran away at the first opportunity, and Alina was unexpectedly impressed by the dark-haired, tall, handsome man. After the guests were escorted out, Fred walked into the small kitchen where his parents were washing dishes. Mom, Dad. Fred pulled a bottle of champagne from behind his back. How about the three of us have a drink? We'll just sit and talk as a family. The parents nodded amicably, and in a few minutes the three were sitting around a small table. Parents, my dears. I have big news for you. Fred raised his champagne glass solemnly. I'm in love. The message was met with silence. Jane Ivanovna carefully put the untouched glass on the table. Father, on the contrary, drank the champagne in one gulp and exhaled noisily. May I ask who? The mother looked at her son carefully. A girl, Mother. A girl. Fred laughed. That's good, his father joked to lighten the mood a little. Do you think it's funny? Jane looked at her husband. Well, what kind of a girl is she, may I ask? A lovely girl. Beautiful, intelligent, funny, completely unusual. All in all, the best qualities in the world. At least that's the way she seems to me. Fred was unusually enthusiastic. I'm not interested in this girl's mental qualities. Not yet, anyway. Who is she? Jane looked at her son meaningfully. Her name is Brandy, and she's a senior at the teacher's college. She wasn't born in this town, and she has parents, or rather her mom, because her dad died. Her mom is a perfectly normal person. Fred looked at his mother defiantly. Okay, but it's clear to me. Are you out of your mind? She jumped up and paced the kitchen excitedly. So you're going to marry a penniless country girl with a stupid name and a teacher's diploma, who probably has a bunch of equally penniless alcoholic relatives. Father looked reproachfully at his wife. And you don't say anything at all, she shouted. This is the result of your upbringing. He does what he wants. Have you thought about me? You know I'm not allowed to worry with my heart. Jane has resorted to the unfortunate trick all mothers use. Please calm down, Fred mumbled guiltily. What about Lone? She called me just today, complaining that she couldn't get in touch with you. What do you think you're doing? Mom, I'm not interested in Alina. Remember that once and for all. You hear me? And Brandy? I proposed to her. We're getting married as soon as she graduates. You can take it or leave it, it's up to you. I'm sorry. Fred turned and walked out, but he could see his father applauding him without his wife noticing. Brandy and Fred had a modest wedding, attended by Piper and Aunt Jane on the bride's side. Jane Ivanovna sat through the festivities with an expression of grief on her face. After the wedding, the young people flew to New York, where they spent almost 2 weeks. They lived, of course, at Amber's, who received them with open arms. After returning from New York, Brandy and Fred settled in a small one-room apartment that Fred had gotten from his grandmother. A year later, they had a son named Anthony. Jane Ivanovna never came to terms with her son's choice and did not accept Brandy. Even the birth of an adorable, healthy grandson didn't soften her mood. You ruined my son's life, she said flatly when she was finally alone with her daughter-in-law. Don't think I'm going to let it go. Brandy's life had become a living hell. And worst of all, Fred, having quickly fallen back under his mother's influence, began to rapidly drift away from his wife after a couple of years. Jane constantly and methodically turned Fred against his wife. And scandals in the young family began to happen more and more often, and for any reason. Hey Brandy, are you buying powder? Mom says it's completely useless and expensive. My mom was picking up potatoes from daycare yesterday. She says he's the worst dressed. Brandy. Mom brought you some patties. She said you shouldn't buy store-bought anymore. They give me heartburn. Listen, Fred, Brandy couldn't take it anymore. If I hear you say the words Mom said one more time, I'm going to scream. I can't take it anymore, do you hear me? I feel like I'm not living with you and our son, but with your mother. She comes into our house without asking and goes through our stuff. Why don't we invite her into our bed? Don't you realize she's just manipulating us? And her only goal is to break us up. Don't you dare talk bad about my mother. If it weren't for her, we wouldn't even be able to pay for this apartment. Yeah, I agree. Because you've been unemployed for 3 months. Go to hell, shouted Fred in a frenzy of anger. Brandy grabbed a thin bandage and ran out into the yard. When she returned half an hour later, she said, "Let's get a divorce." "Let's do it," Fred replied indifferently. Brandy and her son went to her grandfather's cozy old home, where they were welcomed without question or reproach. She finally went to work, as she had dreamed, in the very school her father had once built. And a year later, at the school assembly, she met a new school teacher named James. He was the man who had captured her heart once and for all. Seeing Anthony and Fred Brandy never got in the way of seeing them, and brought her son into town, regularly making arrangements with her ex-husband in advance. "Why are you home?" Jane Ivanovna looked with distaste at her son lying on the couch in the middle of the day. "Shouldn't you be with Anthony? Didn't they bring him to you?" "No, they didn't. Something happened there. I don't get it. Brandy's gone somewhere." Fred tried to sleep in his pillow. "What do you mean she's gone? Were you supposed to see the baby today?" Jane asked. "What does she think she's doing?" "I'm going to call her now and have her try to explain." Brandy's cell phone didn't answer, so Jane Smith dialed the long-distance code and the phone number at the Dabson house. "Hello," the voice on the phone was clearly a child's voice. "Hello," Jane Smith replied sternly. "Put Brandy on the phone for me." "Aunt Brandy isn't home. She flew to New York with Grandpa John and Aunt Piper. Her grandmother died there. I can't remember her name. It's a complicated name. She gave Aunt Brandy the same complicated word. Anyway, it's all Brandy there now." For all the rambling, childish speech, the meaning of what was said was clear. This girl has someone in New York, and this someone bequeathed her something. Very interestingly, some vague memory touched Jane, but she clearly knew something, only she couldn't recall it. And that something was directly related to Brandy and what her connection to the capital was. "Fred, do you remember after your so-called wedding, you flew to New York and stayed with some relative of theirs?" She woke her dozing son and tugged demandingly at his sleeve. Even now, the woman didn't say Brandy's names out loud, her relatives' names, but made do with pronouns. So we lived," Fred shrugged. "Why do you want to know now?" "If I'm asking, I have to. Remember exactly where and with whom you lived. It's very important. But I think it was Grandma Brandy's." "Yeah, that's right. I think she was her grandfather's sister, widow of some professor or academic. I don't really get it, but she's a worldly woman. She's very smart, and she loves her, you can tell. She even called her something affectionate. I don't remember how." "Oh, my girl. Where does she live?" "In an apartment." "Where's that?" Jane irritably interrogated her confused son. "The apartment is cool and big. You can't see the Kremlin, of course, but it's 3 minutes to the subway. And there's another 5 minutes and you're already in Times Square." "The apartment is 5 minutes from Times Square." Jane even sat down for a minute, because her legs wouldn't hold her. The widow of a New York professor or even an academic. How much could such an apartment be worth? $1 million? Or even tens of millions? Wow! Did Jane really pay off that girl? Well, it's still fixable. That country girl loves her fool, but Jane is no match for her. She's not to be trifled with. "Sweetheart." My girl Jane sat across from Brandy in the small cafe she'd invited her to for a serious conversation. "I'm sorry to you. It's just that things didn't work out right from the start. Probably because things with you and Fred happened too fast. It was a bit hectic, and I didn't realize it. When Anthony grows up, you'll know what it's like to have a girl take your son away from you." Jane pretended to be embarrassed. "I'm a silly girl, dear," she continued after a dramatic pause. "When you were separated, I realized how much Fred needed you. He would die without you. My girl, I beg you, come back to him. because it can be fixed, and you'll be happy together. I'll be happy for you at last." Jane clasped her hands together in a pleading gesture. She was very much absorbed in her role as a generous, forgiving mother. And immersed in it all, she didn't look at Brandy. When she did, she finally lowered her arms and pulled herself up. In front of her sat a beautiful, confident young woman, looking at her with a sneer. "Jane, darling," Brandy said, emphasizing the last word. "You've been so kind to me that I'm at a bit of a loss. What's the matter with you? Are you well? I don't think so. I'm even embarrassed to take advantage of your momentary weakness." It was a complete defeat, but she could not allow the last word to go to anyone but herself. "You got so cocky after you got a 4-bedroom apartment in New York with some old paintings on the walls," Jane hissed. Brandy chuckled. "Well, I knew it. That's the reason for your sudden fervor for me. And by the way, your information is inaccurate. The apartment is really a 4-room apartment, and there are several paintings, and they are worth, at a conservative estimate, as much as the apartment," she said. "What's the matter with you, Jane? You shouldn't have given up so soon." Brandy waved at a man entering the cafe. "I'd like you to meet him. This is Andrew, my husband. We are, with your permission, leaning in. When you're in New York, give us a call." Brandy and her husband had long since left. Jane sat at the cafe table, tears rolling helplessly down the corners of her eyes. She finally wiped her eyes angrily, and as she stood up, she noticed a small piece of paper left on the table by Brandy. She picked it up and read a few words: "Don't believe. Don't be afraid. Don't ask. Don't cry. Don't wait. Don't fuss. And don't hope."
Opening the door at the knock, the widower was stunned to see a nun with twins. He had not expected such a surprise. P4. Christian walked slowly to the bus stop. It was Thursday, and he still had 2 days left to work, when he would gladly say goodbye to his factory to spend the weekend without it. For years now, the man had worked at the trailer plant as the former saint. Louis Plant was called. It had once rattled the country. They made good quality truck trailers, so those who knew how to use them bought them, both for their business and for their personal use. But like everywhere else, times have changed, and the former large factory was emptied. Not that it was completely closed, but many shops were rented by furniture factories and plastic window manufacturers. In general, the big for the city production was closed. The state administration was trying to keep it going, but it barely had a glimmer of life in it. That's why Christian stayed there. He used to have a pretty good job by those standards. He even managed to work as chief engineer for a while. But the plant quickly began to decline, and the chief engineer began to lose its relevance. The man returned to his former post and worked for a few more years as an engineer. But the decline could not be prevented. Therefore, Christian was forced to combine in one person an engineer, a fitter, and a mechanic. For so many years, the man became so accustomed to his factory that he agreed to such conditions. But every year the work became more and more difficult. Not only age, but also great disappointment had an impact. A bus pulled up and the man got on it. There were no more free seats, so he huddled at the end of the cabin near the window. It was rush hour, and there was no point in waiting for another, freer bus. Christian stared blankly out the window. There was a traffic jam on the bypass as usual. The man sighed with frustration. "This is how it is in my life," he thought. "Every day I run into the same traffic jam, but I can't decide to take a new route. How much more patience do I have? Sometimes I think I'll give it all up in a heartbeat because I can't do it anymore." Christian Thompson was a native of the bountiful Houston area of Texas. His town of Burkeville had once, like many others in the region, thrived on farms and ranches. Not to say that the young lad's parents were wealthy men. But his father told his son at once that he must get an education. Austin Thompson's older sister lived in Chicago. There he also wanted to send his son to study at the institute. Aunt Christiana promised to shelter the boy for the duration of his studies at her place, which meant that the boy would never be hungry and would always wear nice clothes that Aunt Caroline bought for him. It's hard to say what the young man wanted then, but Christian was not particularly eager to study engineering and did not want to leave his hometown. And that would have been all right. Maybe Christian would have stayed after studying in Chicago, which he eventually got used to, if it weren't for one thing. Carl Hill was the town administrator at the time. He held on to his position with a deadly grip. Of course, he turned a few things around for himself from time to time. He had a beautiful daughter, Madison. She was in the same class as Christian. For years, the girl had been in love with Christian, and the older she got, the more she thought about how she could marry him. The fact that he went to study in Chicago, she was not particularly embarrassed. He usually came home for the holidays, and they saw each other a lot. You don't need him. Carl used to swear at his daughter. There are so many nice guys out there, and you're clinging to your Christian like a bulldog that you can't get away from him. He was angry. Daddy, I love him. The girl sobbed. If I ever marry, it'll be to him. Madison's father tried to persuade her, but nothing worked, so he went to Austin Thompson. Hello, Austin. I've got something serious to say to you, Carl said. What is it, Carl? Austin was surprised. Do they want to check the fields again? No, it's a personal matter, he said dryly. You and I need to talk about Christian. About Christian? The farmer asked in surprise. Come on, let's go and talk. What's wrong with my Christian? Austin, your Christian is a good guy, said the town administrator from afar. He doesn't drink too much, he's a smart guy. Here's what I'm thinking. Should we do Christian's wedding to Madison? Not only is my daughter beautiful, but she's a hard worker. No bad deeds to speak of. You want to marry your Madison to my Christian? Austin looked at him in amazement. He still has 2 years of schooling to go. It's okay. Madison loves him so much that she'll wait, Carl smiled. Besides, I'm not going to hurt them. You know me, they'll live happily ever after. Carl, I don't know. Christian's father scratched his head. He hasn't thought about marriage yet. And anyway, maybe he has someone in Chicago? Do you think he tells me that? The farmer laughed. Austin, but you talked to him. Madison's father looked at him carefully. Explain everything to him. He'll listen to you. There's no reason for him to go to a foreign country when he has such a bride waiting for him at home. Christian's father was puzzled by his conversation with the receptionist. It wasn't that he was against Madison, but he'd rather have his son make his own choice. Austin, I think Carl is right. Camila, Christian's mother, supported the administrator. Let him come home. Carl will give him a good place here. With his education, everything is possible here. And Madison is a good girl, homely, she'll be a good hostess. What if he already has someone there? Dad objected. We're spoiling the guy's life plans. So what she said coldly. Is it better for you that your son is here, at your side, in a good position, or in some unknown place carrying sacks? You're the father, you talk to him about it. For a long time, Austin put off talking to his son. It was just before Christmas when he called him. Well, son, don't you miss home? Father asked cautiously. What are your plans after graduation? Honestly, I do, Christian answered. I'm used to Chicago after all these years, but I still want to go home. I don't know about plans yet. Well, maybe you have a job in mind, Austin continued. Or a serious relationship. I don't have either of those things. Christian answered with annoyance in his voice. I think about it all the time myself. I look at job ads to see what's on offer here. What about Madison Hill? Austin couldn't help himself. She's a good girl, and you know who her father is. What's Madison got to do with it? I don't get it, the boy said. Son, we just found out recently that Madison has been in love with you for a long time, his father said quietly. So we thought you two would make a good couple. Dad, I don't really see her as my girlfriend, Christian laughed. To be honest, I've never even thought about it. But look at her, son, insisted his father. Carl promises you a good position. Have you already decided everything without me? The boy got angry, but then added more calmly, all right. I'll think about it. I'll probably go home anyway." Austin shuddered. The bus driver braked sharply. The man cursed to himself, but it was all right, and he stared out the window again. Behind him the trees appeared, from which a strong wind was tearing off autumn leaves. "This is how another year will soon end," the man whispered annoyingly. "And the next one I'll be 55 already. How quickly old age has come," he sighed. Austin sank back into his thoughts. The bus was taking him northwest, and he knew the route by heart. After the fourth-year session, Christian came home. He had already given his father his consent, so all their relatives were preparing for the matchmaking. "I don't want to marry Madison," the boy hesitated. "I don't like her. But maybe that's how it happens. First you don't like her, and then you love her." "Well, son," his father said to him a few days later, "are you ready for matchmaking?" "Oh, Dad, I don't know," the son confessed frankly. "I'm not going to Madison's house." "It'll all blow over," his mother assured him. "Do you think I married your father for love? Rarely do people marry for love. I think true love comes later, when you have a family. Your father and I have been together for years, and I wouldn't trade him for anyone else." The matchmaking was a big deal. You couldn't make a mockery of it in front of the chief of the town. Christian's uncle was a big talker. He had, as they say, a loose tongue. The whole matchmaking thing was fun. He never shut up. "Well, Christian, son?" Carl hugged him. "Madison's going to wait for you for a year. And next August we'll have a wedding." Madison was incredibly beautiful. She stood in a soft pink dress and kept lowering her eyes in embarrassment. "Can we really make it work and have a good life looking at the girl?" the guy thought. "Madison is actually very pretty." After the matchmaking, the young men started dating. They needed to get to know each other better. Christian told her stories from his life in Chicago. The girl listened to them with interest. Madison talked about their life in the village, told the boy about her dreams. "You know, Christian, I want so much for our children to stay in the village like we did, to run their own business," the girl said with tenderness in her voice. "But still, some of them will want to study, and some of them will even be against staying here and will go to the city." The boy objected to her. "Yes, I understand," Madison sighed. "You know, I'd like to build a family nest so our chicks won't leave it," she laughed. She laughed. Madison was ordinary in Christian's eyes. She wasn't educated. Carl didn't want to let her go to town. But there was some worldly wisdom in her. She was easy for a guy to be with. By the end of the summer, Christian even thought he was falling in love with Madison. When the guy went back to Chicago, they talked almost every day on the phone his aunt had in her flat. And Christian had gotten so used to it that when a major event happened in his life, he was just blown away. So many years passed, but Christian never thought about it. One day he made a promise to himself that the man had kept for years. The bus turned onto a familiar street and Christian caught his breath. He got off at the stop and headed towards the traffic lights. He needed to cross to the other side of the street, and there he could say he was already at work. The man pulled out his pass and walked through the gatehouse. A crowd was already gathering in the lobby. Everyone was in a hurry to get to work. Christian walked outside and headed towards his building. "Christian, hello," the director ran up to him. "What about the order? We have all the details ready." "Yesterday, Charles and I finished the 20th piece out of 30, he replied. "So we should probably be done by today and tomorrow." "All right," smiled the chief. "You'll let me know when everything will be ready." The man nodded his head and went towards the workroom. His partner was already sitting there, having changed his clothes. "Well, Charles," Christian said, "can we finish it today and tomorrow?" "You bet," the boy smiled broadly at Christian. "Honestly, I'm tired of these billets," said Christian. "These blanks are so uncomfortable to work with." The man and the boy went into the workshop and started up their machines. Christian sank back into his thoughts. "Son, do you want me to turn Carl down now?" His father shouted angrily, talking to Christian on the phone. "No, that's not going to happen. The wedding will be in August, just like we planned it." The guy was coming home with a heavy heart after defending his diploma. The next day he invited his aunt to a cafe as a thank you. But another day later he left quickly. He never came to Chicago after that. The wedding was very expensive. Carl was marrying off his only daughter, so despite all his greed, he organized the holiday with all the scope. Almost the entire village was at the wedding. Madison signed all the marriage documents and looked at the guests, happy. "Christian, I'm so happy," she whispered to her fiancé. "I'll never forget this day." The guy also realized that he would never forget this day. Only unlike his bride, it was the most mournful day of his life. Several years passed. Christian worked as an engineer in administration. He and Madison had a good life. Over time, the guy settled down, if you could call it that, appreciated Madison, and began to feel happy too. Everything would have been great, but as often happens in such cases, there was one but it did not work out for young people to have children. Nobody knew what the reason was. They went to Los Angeles and New York. But all the doctors said that it was too early. 2 years for family life is not an indicator. But then 5 years went by, and 7 years went by, and 10 years went by. Madison came in crying one day. "Christian, I can't take it anymore," she sobbed. "I'm begging you, let's get out of here. People's tongues are driving me crazy with their gossip. I don't want to see anyone else here." People were cruel to other people's grief. Every now and then someone would come up with one version or the other. Why didn't Madison and Christian have kids? "It's the right thing to do," the neighbors said to the woman. Her father stole so much for himself back in the day. Now she's paying for his sins. And he walked around here like a master, sticking his nose up. The neighbors supported the conversation. He looked down on everyone, and when he pities someone, he doesn't. On the contrary, he drowned that person. "I heard that Christian is walking away from Madison." An elderly man intervened in the conversation. "He found someone from a neighboring town. That's why they don't have children, because they sleep in separate beds at night." Father Madison didn't have as much power as he used to. He had stepped down as mayor and couldn't shut his mouth to anyone else. He realized that Madison's town was suffering. Everyone turned against her in an instant. "All right," Madison, Carl said to his daughter one day. "Sell the house here and buy a flat in Los Angeles. I'll give you some extra money." Christian was so used to his life in the city that he didn't really want to go to the big city, and all the hustle and bustle of the capital tired him out. But seeing the suffering of his wife, the man finally agreed to move. So in the life of Christian appeared trailers, where he worked for almost 20 years. "Charles, drop everything. Let's go to lunch," shouted the man to his partner. "It's after 2 o'clock. "Well, we've done a lot of work today," the guy laughed as they went into the room. "Christian, I want to give you a treat today." Taking jar after jar out of the bag, Charles smiled. "It was Mom who told me to give you her famous tomato juice. And some very tasty winter vegetables, too. Oh my God, 2 jars of raspberry jam. I almost forgot." "Oh, Charles, thank you," said the man. "And tell your mom thank you very much for me. How I've missed such homemade goodies. You know, since my mother died 2 years ago, I have never tasted such delicacies." "You're welcome to eat it," Charles rejoiced. "For a man like you, it's not a pity. You know, I'm lucky to have you. You never swear, you don't pry." The workers had lunch and talked for about half an hour. Then they went back to their machines. The time for work fled imperceptibly. It was already 16:45. The foreman looked at his watch. "Charles, well, let's finish. There are 7 blanks left for tomorrow. I reckon we'll have them done by 4 o'clock." The man and the lad went out through the gatehouse into the street together. Charles went in the opposite direction. He lived in the neighborhood. Christian wandered towards the bus stop. Here's another day gone, he thought as he shivered in the cold Los Angeles wind. Just wish the bus would come faster. I just have to make it to Friday. The bus came, and the man got on it. It was crowded again. The passenger stood in the aisle, hung on the bar, and immersed himself. It was already dark outside, and Christian closed his eyes from fatigue. Suddenly someone shoved him, and there was a clinking of cans. God, I wish they hadn't broken. The man pulled the bag to his chest. Such wealth should be protected, he smiled. The bus seemed to go on endlessly. It took about an hour and a half before it appeared in the southwest. Christian got off of it and walked towards his apartment block. He entered the entranceway, which immediately smelled old and damp. Why aren't there any scents for these old entrances? The man clamped his nose. Sometimes there's nothing to breathe in here. Christian went home and changed his clothes. His stomach rumbled so much that he didn't bother with any formalities. He opened a can of tomatoes and reached in with his hand. "What a delicious meal," the man murmured. "It's been a long time since I've had such a delicious meal. Where were my fried potatoes in the fridge? Together it's going to be a real bomb." Christian ate dinner, washed the dishes, and sat down on his favorite sofa. The television was sometimes a real outlet for him. Not that he was into political squabbles, but watching some films made him forget his loneliness. The man glanced at the sideboard. There, a picture of his wife Madison stood in the most prominent place. Since moving to Los Angeles, Madison had been trying to get a job somewhere. Staying at home in the flat was very hard for her. They had neither a summer cottage nor a farm, and that made the woman even more discouraged. She dreamed of having children, but she and her husband had no luck. Maybe it was the longing for their native places. Maybe it was Madison's failure to fulfill herself as a mother. The woman began to fade. At first, Christian thought his wife was really depressed, so he often sent her home to her father, but it didn't help. Carl was also very worried about his daughter. Madison began to take first to doctors, then to all sorts of women. But the woman never recovered. At the age of 42, Madison died. She was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Christian suffered a lot at first. He had grown so accustomed to his Madison over the years that he couldn't imagine life without her. The man often sat silently in his flat for hours on end. Only work saved him. But come the weekend, it would start all over again. Carl insisted that his daughter was buried in his hometown, so Christian often did not come to her. And in time he realized that he had to let it all go, or his life would end just as soon. Christian took the picture of his wife in his hands, looking at it closely. Madison was so beautiful in it. Radiant smile, he thought. Would she be alive now if we hadn't moved to the city? It was a question that had been on his mind all these years. That night the man did not sleep well. A longing came over him, and by midnight tears began to choke him. Christian cried for both his Madison and himself. He was alone, left with no one to care for him. 5 years ago his father died first, and a couple of years ago his mother died as well. He had no siblings. His father's older sister from Chicago was still alive. But that topic was closed once and for all for the man. The next morning Christian looked at himself in the mirror in horror. His eyes were puffy. "God, it's like I've been drinking all night," he said in shock. "And I have to work today." He tried a massage, and after an hour his eyes looked better. Christian got dressed and went to his bus stop. And that morning it was the same as always. The bus took him to work and left. The man crossed Wilshire Avenue and walked through the gatehouse. "Christian, are you sick?" Charles asked worriedly, looking at the foreman's swollen face. "Yes, I haven't slept all night," he admitted. "Do you know how lonely it is at that age?" The man sighed. "Sometimes you feel so much pressure that you don't want to live." "Christian, you're still so young. You should get married," the assistant said seriously. "What's your age? You're not 70 years old." Though even at that age some people manage to have affairs. "Charles, where am I going to find a normal woman at that age?" he asked with frustration in his voice. "Nobody wants romantics like me." "Come on," laughed the boy. "My uncle got married for the 5th time when he was 65. "Wow," laughed the foreman. "He didn't get a medal for that. How much nerve you have to have for 5 wives. I certainly would not have endured so many of them." "As he says, I was happy with each of them," Charles replied. "That's why, at 75, he's blooming and smelling." "Charles, I'm dreaming that you and I will get through the day and finally go away for the weekend," Christian smiled. Dreaming of a new wife was too much for him. By 4 o'clock, they had worked the remaining 7 billets. They could go home early today. It was an unspoken rule between him and the director. Nicholas approached the chief of men. "That's it," he said. "So let's look at engineering from Monday, because I'm already tired of this machine." He agreed. "We need to finish the project there. You look at the drawings then." "That's my job," Christian sighed. "I'm the reaper. I play the tune, and I warm myself by the stove. Christian, what can I do? Nicholas looked at him tiredly. If we had other volumes, I could take more men. But we are living from bread to kivashu. I understand everything, answered the engineer. I have no complaints about you, to ruin such a plant. Try to build such a plant again. It would cost $1 billion. Yes, sighed the chief. How hard and time-consuming it is to build, but so quick and easy to destroy. That evening, Christian opened another can that Charles's mum had given him. He crunched the delicious pickled vegetables with pleasure. Then he felt homesick again and couldn't sleep for a very long time. All right, tomorrow is a day off anyway. I'll sleep till lunchtime, said the man, when he saw the clock hand frozen on the number 3. It was raining outside the window in October, and Christian slept until lunchtime. He opened his eyes with difficulty. The man lay in bed for a while longer. The heating hadn't been switched on yet, and the flat was cold. Who invented this stupid rule that the heating must be switched on when the average daily temperature has not exceeded 8 degrees centigrade for 5 days? Christian was indignant. And the fact that it's so cold in the flat that you don't even have to take off your coat is of no interest to anyone, especially here with these damn winds. How could a city be built in such an inconvenient place? And it was true. Even though Los Angeles was in the west, it was always being blown around by the winds. There were times when even in the summer a strong, cold wind blew. The whirlwinds that swirled the praying rubbish bags in the air here lifted up to the very top floors of the 14-story buildings. Finally, Christian crawled out of his bed and, wrapping himself in a blanket, went to the kitchen. 5 minutes later, his body was warmed by hot tea. This is how to go outside. He watched in horror as the rain poured down and the wind bent the trees to the ground. You can't take an umbrella with you, the wind will break it at once. For half an hour, the man tried to go through his wardrobe to find something to wear. The fridge was empty, except for the raspberry jam Charles's mum had given him and half a forkful of cabbage. Well, God willing, Christian said to himself and pulled on his Macintosh. He went out into the street. He walked hard against the wind to get to the nearest shop. The rain was hitting him right in the face. I'll beat you anyway, the man thought, looking at his high rubber boots. I'm sure you won't get my feet wet. Finally, he opened the door to the shop and took out his big bag. Why did he reach into his pocket and pull out the list? So what have we got here? He looked down the list. Potatoes, carrots, beetroot, butter, soup set, kefir, 2 yogurts. Christian, read. In general, you don't even have to read, but just take everything I see from the shelves, he sighed. The man spent about an hour in the shop. His basket was completely full. Did he forget anything? He asked himself. I don't think so. And he hadn't taken anything extra. It was harder for the wind to move the man. But in spite of the weight of the bag, he was being tossed back and forth by the wind. What is this lousy climate? Christian cursed. It's called the South. It wasn't this cold in Minneapolis. Though Minneapolis had long since been renamed, the man had never called it that. It remained Minneapolis to him forever. Christian returned home. He understood that in this weather one should warm up with hot tea or hot soup, or rather borscht. Now that was another matter. A whiff enveloped the spoon where the hot borscht was steaming. Now I won't freeze, Christian thought, but the day was so gray and dull that he didn't feel like doing anything. Sometimes on weekends he read a magazine, but today the man was in no mood at all. He lay down on his old sofa and fell asleep almost instantly. Young Christian paced nervously on the platform. It was hot outside. At last a train approached, and the boy boarded it. It was a few minutes before the train was due to depart, when suddenly a familiar face appeared on the platform. "Christian," shouted the girl. "Christian." She ran from one carriage to another. Suddenly she saw his face in the window and ran to the carriage door. But the conductor had already raised the steps, and the train moved quietly on. "Christian." The girl ran back to the window where she saw the boy. "I love you. Don't go away." She ran after the carriage. The girl reached the end of the platform and stopped. She shouted something for a long time. Christian saw her tears, her voice pierced his whole body, and he woke up sharply. "Why am I dreaming about her?" he shouted in anger. "When are you going to leave me alone?" With anger, Christian threw his pillow on the floor. He sat down unhappily on the sofa. He generally didn't like to remember what had happened to him back then, but about 10 years ago, he had started to be haunted by the same dream. Christian always felt bad after it. To divert his attention, he walked over to the sideboard and picked up his wife's photograph. "I did the right thing," then he said loudly, "so let everyone leave me alone." After a few minutes, he began to feel better. The man got up and went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. "The ladder will give me a chance to warm up," he said sadly, "and you can't go out in this weather." He could go shopping, but Christian didn't want to go out in this wind and rain. He turned on the TV, changed channels, and found some kind of film. "Detective isn't on right now," he sighed and changed the channel. There was a program about becoming a father. "Well, we'll see," Christian smiled. "Even though I don't need it, I'll look at the little kids and maybe I'll be in a better mood. They are all so cute." The man listened with interest as the young dads talked about the difficulties of parenthood. Some couldn't sleep at night, some were afraid to approach their child for a while. There were some who developed depression and tried to avoid their newborn babies. "I wonder what kind of dad I would be," Christian thought. "Would I be able to hold a newborn so easily? And how would I feel?" The man didn't notice how quickly the time flew by. He savored the feelings that babies evoked in his heart. "Oh, what a pretty little thing." He laughed as he looked at the 3-month-old boy on the screen. He is already trying to hold his head up. "I wish I had the kind of courage these kids have." It seems that they are not afraid of anything in life. They are interested in trying everything. This little girl is looking at rattles with such interest. You can see that she's studying it. The program ended and Christian's mood lifted. The sight of little children seemed to breathe life into him. The man smiled all evening. "How I would like to hold such a baby in my arms at least once," he said dreamily. That evening he went to bed early and, to his great surprise, fell asleep without any problems. But here are the miracles, really. Looking out of the window, Christian looked out. Yesterday it had been deep autumn, and today it was true spring. The sun had been shining outside since morning, and it was very warm for October. No way, the man wondered. Has Indian summer begun, or is it its continuation? We should definitely go out today, because now we don't know when the weather will be so nice. Christian got dressed and went out onto the balcony. He could hear birds singing in the trees. The man pressed the lift button and went outside. Where should I go? He stopped in bewilderment on the street. To Victory Park. I don't want to. There are all those awful merry-go-rounds and unpleasant sounds there. You have to go so far away from the central alley there not to hear all that. Why don't we go to Chilean or Taman Forest? There'll be a lot of people there tonight, so I won't get lost. Probably the Taman Forest, Christian decided. Indeed, because of the good weather, there were a lot of people walking around the park. There were parents with their children, who ran merrily along the paths and constantly asked their mums and dads questions. Breathing was easy and good. Colorful leaves were falling from above, and there was no beginning or end to this waltz. Christian saw a tree lying on the ground and sat down on it. The man closed his eyes with pleasure. It's so nice here, he whispered. The air is so fresh after the rain. The main paths were asphalted, so it was safe to walk here without fear of mud. Christian still wanted to walk around the park for a while, but he was so hungry that he couldn't stand the feeling of hunger any longer. The man walked out of the forest and headed towards the bus stop. Today was a wonderful day, he smiled. A walk like this is good for me. It chased away all my moping. Finally, the man got off at the bus stop and headed towards his house. He stroked his stomach with anticipation. Christian quickly jumped into the lift and eagerly opened the door to his flat. He quickly undressed and put the borscht on the cooker. With light movements, he sliced the sausage into large slices and sat down at the table. No sooner had he taken the spoon in his hand than the doorbell rang. Damn it, Christian swore. Who the hell is that? He got up unhappily from the table and headed for the door. The man looked through the peephole in amazement. Some women in black clothes were standing in the corridor. "Oh my God, who is that?" he thought in shock. Christian decided not to open the door yet, but the strangers on the other side were not satisfied with that decision. The women continued to press the bell. "Who is it? What do you want?" Christian couldn't take it anymore. "We want Christian Thompson," came a woman's voice. "We're from the convent." "What convent?" The man marveled. "You must have me confused with someone else. I have nothing to do with religion." From the St. John of Mary convent came the same voice. "I'm Mother Superior. Please open up. We have very important business to discuss with you." Christian hesitated for a while and opened the door. The man looked at the uninvited guests with a displeased look. "What business do you have with me?" he said coldly. "But let's make it quick, because I'm very busy." "I'm sorry, but I can't tell you everything in a minute," said the nun with kindness in her voice. "You see, a few days ago a young woman came to our monastery for a tour. She looked to be about 30 years old. She asked to meet me and talk to me. We talked about her personal life. The woman asked me to give her advice on what she should do. She called herself Nancy, but I don't think that was her real name. She came to the convent a few times, but when we made our rounds this morning, we found this." She pointed to a basket of some kind. It was quite capacious. "Well, what is it? What does it have to do with?" the man asked with interest. "Well, as far as I am concerned, it has something to do with you." Mother Superior sighed and took the basket from her novice's hands. The woman opened the coverlet and Christian immediately turned pale. In it, 2 little girls were sleeping sweetly. They were boys, judging from their blue suits. "Whose children are these?" He couldn't stand it. "What have they got to do with me?" "Well, read this." The nun held out the note. "We found this in the basket with the children." "I'm sorry, but I can't keep these children anyway. By the time you find them, I'll be long gone. I'm leaving the country forever. I ask you very much to find my father, Christian Thompson, and give him my children," read the landlord. "This is some kind of mistake," shouted the man. "I don't have any children. My wife and I have never been able to have a child, and I've never had anyone but her." "Well, we can do a DNA test, and then you will decide what you want to do with the babies." Mother Superior looked at him sternly. "I'm not going to do anything," Christian said indignantly. "I can see that someone is trying to set me up." "I don't know if you have anything to do with these children," the nun continued. "But what I do know is that you will have to deal with the police, and they will interrogate you in any case until a genetic test for your relationship is carried out." The woman did not lower her voice. "So it's up to you. Either you deal with us or with the police." "But if they're not my grandchildren, what then?" The man tried to dodge. "You will apologize to me for making me nervous." "I serve God," she replied calmly. "And for him, the most innocent are defenseless children. I have nothing to apologize for." "All right," Christian gave up. "What am I to do with them now?" "The children will stay with us for the time being," Mother Superior smiled. "Until you have a DNA test. Besides, there's always the possibility that their mother will change her mind and take them back." "Okay, I'll come by tomorrow before lunch and find out how we can get that test done," the man said unhappily and looked questioningly at the women. "Is there anything else?" "No," replied the guest. "Thank you. We will be expecting you tomorrow. Please try to make it as soon as possible. We can't keep the boys here for long either. It's illegal." Christian closed his door. He lost his appetite and lay down on the sofa, exhausted. What a good start to the day, he resented. They had to ruin it like that. I had no one but Madison. Somebody was trying to make a fool out of me. Somebody was trying to set me up. But I'll show you. You think it's that easy to pin all this on me? I'm sure your test won't show any parentage. The next day, Christian woke up in a terrible mood. Not only did he have a headache, but he also had to ask Nicholas for time off. Today they were going to look at old and new projects, but the chief, without telling him anything, allowed him to do his own thing until lunchtime. I have to spend so much money on this rubbish, Christian said in shock when he was told the price for the test. I have nothing else to do. Who will reimburse me for all this? In spite of his inner protests, he asked the nurse to come to the monastery and take the test for him and the babies. The man looked furtively at the babies. He was drawn to them by some invisible force. Christian quickly restrained himself and left the convent room. "The test will be ready in 5 days," the nurse said. "You'll get a notification on your phone." 5 days. The man asked in horror. "Is that how long you have to wait?" "Unfortunately, it can't be any quicker," she explained. "The reagents have to be aged for a certain period of time so that the right genes can be detected." A sullen Christian went back to work. Nothing pleased him. He had hoped that the next day he would know the results and forget about the case once and for all. But now it turned out that he would have to suffer for 5 whole days. Who could have given this girl this idea? Thought the engineer. How did she even know my name? Maybe one of my former colleagues played a joke on me like that. And now I have to deal with all this. The man sat there thinking about his own thoughts while the director explained something to him. "Well, do you agree?" Nicholas asked him. "Shall we do it that way?" "What?" Christian came back to reality. "I'm sorry I wasn't listening to what you said." "Christian, is something wrong with you?" The chief asked him worriedly. "Don't even think about being sick. We've got a big order for parts coming in." "No, it's just that I was up all night with a headache," he replied. "What did you say to me again?" "After work." For the first time in a long time, Christian didn't want to go home. He had a feeling that something bad was waiting for him there. Or rather, there was some kind of surprise waiting for him there. What could be worse than what had already happened? He pondered. Only if it all turns out to be true, a thought popped into his head. The man stopped abruptly. It was as if he was dumbfounded. Christian realized that such a thing was simply impossible. But something inside insisted that by some miracle it had happened. "I'll go crazy while I wait for this result," the man said out loud and walked towards the bus stop. The bus was traveling as it always did. But it seemed to the man that this day the bus was just flying. He looked at his watch, but the bus was on schedule. "How I don't want to go home." He stopped. "I'll go somewhere and take a walk." Christian turned round and walked in the opposite direction from his house. The weather wasn't bad today either, not as warm as yesterday, but still. It was starting to get dark, and passers-by were bustling in the street. A man stopped near some public garden and stood there for a long time. It was as if he had fallen somewhere. He was not interested neither in the dog that ran up to him and started barking at him, nor in the loving couple sitting on the bench, nor in the loud music of teenagers. It was as if everything had stopped, but the man felt such a warmth on his heart that he was even afraid to move. Christian was afraid that if he took even one step, this lightness would immediately disappear. "God, what's happening to me?" He finally came to his senses. "What am I doing here? Oh my God, it's 8 o'clock. I've got to go home." He walked briskly towards his house, having a light supper because he had lost his appetite. Sweet tea and a scone sufficiently satisfied his hunger, and he went to bed. Some strange things are happening to me, a thought occurred to him. What does it all mean, he thought, and with this question he fell asleep. 3 days passed, and the man even somehow calmed down. He no longer thought about the test. He had the confidence that everything was going to be all right. I had nothing to do with it at all, he rejoiced at his intuition. I'll finally get the test back tomorrow and get on with my life again. Christian excused himself from work an hour early so he could pick up the test at the lab in time. The man reluctantly changed his clothes and gathered his belongings. He said goodbye to Charles and walked out of the gatehouse. It was drizzling outside. Surprisingly, there was no wind. Christian opened his umbrella and walked to the bus stop. He didn't have to wait long. In 5 minutes, he was already sitting in the minibus. Well, I'll pick up everything quickly and go home right away, he dreamed. Tomorrow I'll be informed so they won't bother me anymore, he smiled. As it happened, the minibus was traveling very slowly. Christian fidgeted unhappily in his seat. It's like the disabled are driving, the passenger said angrily to himself. And who employs drivers like that? Another 20 minutes had passed when the driver told Christian that he was getting off at the next stop. The man thanked him just in case. He paid and quickly got off the shuttle bus. So where do I go next? He reasoned. They told me it was at the beginning of the street. Then I'd better turn here. Christian got lost and lost about 30 minutes. The man cursed out loud at himself and finally asked the passers-by for the right direction. 300 meters later, the starting numbers showed up. So it must be around here somewhere? He rejoiced and hurried to the beginning of the street. Christian ran into the lab and gave his name. About 5 minutes later, he was handed the result in an envelope. He opened it at once. 96%, Christian read aloud and turned pale. Then he came to his senses and approached the man at the counter. Tell me, please. Does 96% in the test mean that I have no relation? He asked excitedly. On the contrary, the girl smiled. 96% is a very high probability that you are related. You could say it is. Sabrina, can you hear me? The voice repeated insistently for several minutes to Sabrina. Finally, the girl opened her eyes and looked around at all the men and women present in white coats with an incomprehensible look. She realized that she was probably in a hospital. Where am I? Sabrina barely spoke. What happened to me? Paula. You fell off the scaffolding, the doctor answered her. Your daughter is staying with your mother for the time being. The girl closed her eyes tiredly and was pulled down again. From somewhere at the beginning of the tunnel, she could faintly hear sounds. Sabrina came to her senses again after a few days. This time the girl could already stay conscious. She could feel how much her back hurt and her right leg was twisted. The latter was in a cast. You're here for a long time, the nurse sighed. So you'd better stop fussing. We called your mother. The doctor said you could see her. My daughter Paula, said the victim. Ask her to bring my daughter. 2 days later, Sabrina's mother Chloe came. Her daughter didn't notice anything new about her. She was not embarrassed neither by the fact that Sabrina miraculously survived, nor by the fact that she had a quiet granddaughter. How long are you going to be examined here? Instead of greeting, her mother said arrogantly, I'm not here to babysit Paula. Well, you can see for yourself, replied the girl calmly. So you'll have to be patient. I have no relatives here except you. It's not enough that you gave birth to her. Now you want to hang her on me? The woman was angry. Don't even think about it. Hurry up, get up, I won't be with her. Sabrina remained silent and asked her daughter to come closer. The girl of about 5 years old cried and came to her mum. Mummy, the child sobbed, take me away. I don't want to live with my grandmother. She doesn't love me. And it was true. Chloe not only did not love her granddaughter, but she never loved her daughter either. The woman had spent her whole life thinking she was something special. She couldn't live with Sabrina's father. Or rather, he could not stand her arrogance and character and ran away from her. With his daughter, he never communicated for the reason that it was necessary to organize all this through her mother. Chloe from early childhood reproached her daughter for the fact that she was born into the world at all. But how much effort she's put into her, she thought. When the girl was 12, she saw very clearly that love from her mother she did not need to wait. Since that time, the girl, you could say, lived her own life. Sabrina studied well at school, entered the institute and finished it. The girl, as soon as she began to work part-time in the evening, immediately rented a room and moved out from her mother. She was not only not against it, but frankly scolded her daughter with the last words for the fact that it did not happen earlier. In general, with Sabrina's mother never had a friendly relationship, no matter how much she dreamed of it. Chloe thwarted all her attempts. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the girl got pregnant and gave birth to the child herself. No one knew who was the father of Paula, but from that moment Sabrina's mother turned away from her so much that they completely stopped talking. Naturally, no help or support was given by her to her daughter. The girl worked to the last, even when she could barely walk with a big belly. Sabrina had a good friend, Diana, who helped her all this time. After the birth of Paula, Sabrina ran for part-time work together with a small child. The girl did not have her own place. Sometimes her friend sat with the baby. When Paula was 1.5 years old, Sabrina gave her to a kindergarten. The girl herself got a job at a construction site. She was not afraid of heights and easily plastered and made facades of buildings. After 3 years, Sabrina collected enough money to buy a small house in the suburbs. That's where she and Paula lived all this time. Sabrina herself did not realize how she had fallen from the scaffolding. The girl usually always used insurance. She only remembered her foot stumbling and the board bouncing off to the side. Then Sabrina saw herself flying and felt a strong impact, after which she lost consciousness. As the doctor said, she was lucky because it was only the 3rd floor. After Sabrina was brought to the hospital, the issue of Paula and her friend Diana came up. The girl was not given away at that time. They brought the child to her mother. This later played a very big negative role in Sabrina's life. The girl was in the hospital for almost 5 months. Then she was sent to a sanatorium for rehabilitation for another 6 months. All this time, Paula stayed with her mother. Finally, when the girl was discharged and she took her daughter, Sabrina was in complete shock. "I'm not going to eat this," said 6-year-old Paula with her arms crossed over her chest. "And I want to go to Grandma Chloe's. I'm going to live with her from now on. What happened to my child?" The woman looked at her daughter in shock. "Paula, I am your mother, so you will live with me," said Sabrina. "What kind of mother are you?" said the girl angrily. "Do you even know from whom you gave birth to me? Grandma Chloe had a husband, and you?" Sabrina turned pale. She looked at her child and could not recognize her. In almost a year, her mother had made Paula a real monster, just like herself. "And you tell the teacher that you don't want to live with her. Her grandmother used to teach her when she sneaked into the kindergarten. Tell her she beats you, she doesn't buy you anything. Then you will definitely live with me. That's what you want, isn't it?" "Of course, yes," the girl hugged Chloe. "I only love you alone. I don't need her." From that moment in Sabrina's life, there was one problem after another. Paula was always telling stories at daycare that her mother was treating her badly. The girl would sometimes sob for hours to get attention. The social welfare authorities called Sabrina every now and then. "Try to take her to a psychologist," one of the employees advised the woman. "I understand that you don't do all this with her, but there is a reason why she is making all this up. A psychologist will be able to explain it to you." Sabrina tried her best, but she had a lot of health problems after the fall. Her right leg was numb all the time, and she limped and couldn't walk fast enough. She could no longer get a good job. Her leg was hurting her lower abdomen, and she could hardly hold back her tears. "Diana, I'm probably going to go crazy," Sabrina once told her friend and burst into tears. "What am I going to do? Paula doesn't recognize me at all. She doesn't even call me by my first name. She doesn't even say mum to me. How could my mother do this to me? I mean, she did it to me." Chloe was very pleased with herself. She finally took revenge on her daughter Sabrina for everything, for the fact that she took her time, for the pain of labor, for the cost she had incurred. Most importantly, for Sabrina giving birth to Paula by some guy. "Well, now we'll see," Chloe cheered. "You won't have a daughter anymore. Paula will belong to me." The woman looked lovingly at her sleeping granddaughter. The little girl was sleeping sweetly. "Lord, how can such a creature live, and such an angel," she thought, wiping away her tears. "Paula, how I love you. Why are you doing this to me?" But then the girl would wake up and everything would happen again. She spoke to her mother in a lovely tone, blackmailed her into running away to her grandmother's. "Diana, I can't take it anymore," Sabrina came to her friend one day. "I can't take it anymore. Not only I can't work for a long time, my lower back and leg hurt, but now, apparently my right leg is constantly falling off when I'm nervous. Sometimes it just stops moving. I'm afraid I'm going to stop walking soon." "Sabrina," Diana said gently, "maybe you should talk to him. If you want, I'll tell Henry. He'll find his information. He left me without Paula," she sighed. "What would I tell him about her? I'm sorry, but the one night we were together, I got pregnant. If he wanted to, he would have found me a long time ago. I'm not looking for him." Sabrina came in from a friend's house. Her leg hurt again. She lay down on the couch and closed her eyes. Scenes from her past life came before her. There was noise and commotion in the classroom. The first year was very turbulent. There were only 5 girls in a group of 20 students. All the students were looking at each other curiously. No one knew anyone yet. Sabrina sat alone at the last table. She was looking out the window and not participating in all the introductions. Suddenly, some guy sat down in front of her. He put his bag down, but then abruptly turned to the girl and asked her something. She answered him briefly. It seemed to Sabrina that the guy was not from around here. That's how her first encounter with him happened. After a few months, Sabrina realized that she liked the guy. It was almost 5 years later when a romantic relationship began between them. Or rather, it didn't happen until May when they were writing their diploma. Fortunately or not, they were assigned to write their diploma together. Sabrina, the guy, approached her. "Look, I brought the blueprints. We still have to do this last calculation for the diploma." "Yes, everything seems to be good here." The girl looked at the scheme. "You're very good. You've done such a thorough job." She patted him on the shoulder. "Sabrina, let's go to a cafe," suggested the student. "I haven't been away from my desk for almost a week. Let's distract ourselves a little." The girl was very embarrassed. Despite the fact that she liked Christian very much, she was usually cold to him. Before she could answer him, the guy had already put all the blueprints in a tube and was waiting for her by the door. "Are you coming?" he urged the girl on. "Come on, hurry up. I'll tell you honestly, I'm very hungry." The young people went to the student cafe. There they sat for about 2 hours, discussing their diploma and its defense. "I think that you should present the theoretical part, and then I will present the drawings and calculations," Christian suggested. "Okay," Sabrina agreed. "I'm all for it. If you knew how much I dislike calculations." She laughed. "It will be our future work." Christian laughed and looked at her intently, but then he stopped and blushed. They sat in the cafe for a long time. Somehow they went home in one direction. Whether Christian saw the girl off that day or not, it was hard to say, but the young people stopped outside the house where Sabrina rented a room. "Will you stay here?" the girl asked him curiously. "Or will you go home?" "At first I really wanted to leave, but now I don't know," Christian said with annoyance in his voice. "I promised my father that I would come back." "What if you have a job here, a family?" The girl looked him in the eyes. "Well, it's all very complicated for me, Sabrina," he sighed. "I've tied myself to the house without realizing it. I gave my word and I can't break it." "Even if your fate depends on it," she smiled. "Even then, will you come back?" "I don't know," the boy answered tiredly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not living my life. It's like I'm not in my life. My mother and father and other people are there. They want me to do what's best for them. But sooner or later it will all come out," the girl replied. "One day it will make you feel so unhappy." "Maybe you're right," Christian looked at her. "Sabrina, I really like you," he said suddenly. "But I can't." The guy turned abruptly and walked quickly away. The girl could not understand what to do, whether to run after him now or to leave everything as it was. From that day on, Christian began to avoid Sabrina. They met only formally to discuss the diploma. The girl felt that he cared about her, and it only made her feel more painful. Time flew by quickly, and the day of the diploma defense came. Christian and Sabrina defended it with honors. The boy couldn't stand it and approached her. "Let's celebrate our defense," he suggested her. "Let me buy you a last drink. Do you drink champagne?" "Christian, I'm a champagne drinker," she laughed. "I've only had champagne a few times in my life." "All right, let's have champagne," Christian suggested. "You and I will go to a restaurant," Grand Duchess Christian said. "To tell you the truth, I've never been there before, but we must try it sometime." The boys had a good meal and were on their way home late in the evening. Sabrina's champagne hit her head so hard she couldn't stay on her feet. "God, one glass made me so sick," she scolded angrily as Christian took her under his arm. "It's okay. I'll help you," the guy replied caringly. "Don't worry. Everything will be fine." In about 15 minutes, they were outside Sabrina's house. The girl tried to climb the steps, but almost fell down. "Oh shit," she cursed. "I've never had a drink, and after this time I won't drink again." Which floor are we on? She heard Christian's voice. Let me take you up. They went up to the 3rd floor and Sabrina opened the door. But unfortunately, the girl fell when she took off her sandals. The boy picked her up in his arms and carried her into the room. Carefully, he placed the girl on the bed. Christian, when are you going to leave? Please close the door, Sabrina asked him. Because my landlady is in hospital and I'm living alone for the time being. I'll get up later and lock the door. The boy looked intently at the girl. He unconsciously reached out his hand and stroked her hair. Then he began to kiss her. The young people themselves did not notice how something very important happened between them. Christian looked at Sabrina. The girl was sound asleep. He quietly got dressed and left her flat. God, what have I done? He lamented. But don't I love her? Argued 2 voices in his head. I know for a fact that I love Sabrina. I can feel it. But what about Madison, Father? His brain was exploding. What am I going to tell them? The next day, Christian tried to talk to his father, but he flatly refused to listen to him. It's either us or Chicago, Austin said at the end of the conversation. Christian realized that Sabrina was waiting for him, and he needed to go to her. The guy was facing a very difficult choice. His father called him again and started threatening him. Christian packed his things, said goodbye to his aunt, and went to the train station. Sabrina finally found where he lived and rang the doorbell. Yes, he left for the station about an hour ago, Aunt Caroline answered. He's going home today. The girl rushed as fast as she could to the station, and then ran as fast as she could when the train was already on the platform. It took her 5 minutes to run through all the carriages. She spotted Christian, who was sitting on the side seat looking out the window. When he saw Sabrina, the guy jumped up and headed for the exit, but the doors closed right in front of his nose. There was a girl standing on the platform, shouting something to him. The guy rushed back to his seat. Sabrina ran up to him. She screamed that she loved him, begged him to stay. But it was like Christian was paralyzed. All he could do was sit and stare out the window. I'm doing the right thing, it pounded in his head. It's all in the past. I'll never even remember it. Sabrina sat on the platform for hours. She only went home when the tears stopped pouring from her eyes. Many times Sabrina wanted to find Christian and tell him that she was pregnant, but inside the girl felt like she would be in unbearable pain from their meeting. It's not a question of Christian not loving me, she thought afterwards. He couldn't come to his house with me, which means that either his parents didn't want me, or they had already found someone at home for him. So be it, Sabrina decided then. She came to her senses, gingerly getting up from her couch. She was overcome with such a longing that she even found it hard to breathe. First Christian took my life from me, she sighed, and now she is taking my daughter from me. And to her great regret, it was true. No matter how hard Sabrina tried in the following years to save Paula, she never succeeded. Her life was forever ruined by her own mother. Where are you going? Sabrina asked her daughter in amazement as she packed her things. I'm going to my grandmother's house, 16-year-old Paula replied calmly. I'm not going to live with you anymore, Paula. You're not 18 yet. Her mother tried to reason with her. I won't let you. And who are you? The girl asked with a brow in the air. What have you done for me? The woman looked at her daughter in shock. She smiled wryly. The girl did everything to make her mother feel pain from her words. All right, Sabrina said suddenly to herself. Let your grandmother do everything for you now. From now on, I will not interfere in your life. Paula left, and the woman sobbed for a long time. She couldn't come to her senses. But just as Sabrina expected, a few days later her mother called. Do you have a conscience? She said immediately. I need money to support Paula. Didn't you think of that when you turned my daughter against me? The woman replied calmly. Now you have to do it yourself. I will never give you or Paula a penny. And the woman switched off the phone and didn't hear how long her mother was cursing her with the very last words. Sabrina was in a lot of pain, but she had given herself her word that she had left her daughter forever. True, Paula came to her several times and with scandals tried to get money out of her mother, but all was unsuccessful. That's how Sabrina was left alone. With time she calmed down, her leg began to hurt less. The woman was able to get a part-time job. After many years, she was given disability. Many years passed and Sabrina knew nothing about her daughter. There were rumors that she was going to marry a local rich man. Chloe taught her granddaughter. "Paula, your job is to marry a wealthy man," Chloe said. "You have a beautiful figure, not to mention your face. So don't even think of getting involved with some simpleton, or you'll end up the same way as your mother." They worked out a plan together, found the most enviable grooms of the city, and began to act. Chloe pretended to be an intellectual. She wore a hat with a veil, pretended she had taste. Unfortunately, it looked ridiculous from the outside. But the woman was so sure of herself. So they chose Lucas Brown as their victim. Chloe didn't mind that the guy was a bit of a ladies' man. "The main thing is to get him in your net," she taught her granddaughter. "And then he will forget about all his women and will belong only to you." Did the woman believe what she said? It was hard to say. From the outside, it looked more like she was just playing Paula. She liked to control the girl, and she had never realized that all her life she had been fulfilling the whims of an inadequate man. "Grandma, he asked me out on a date." Paula came running home one day. "I think I've got Lucas on the hook now." "You just show him that you have dignity." Chloe was delighted with the news. Act gradually in such situations, never cut from the shoulder. Luck turned in their direction, and Lucas officially announced that his girlfriend was Paula. The girl tried her best not to slap her face in the dirt. Her efforts were not in vain, and Lucas set a wedding day. "Finally, now we will live." Chloe rejoiced. "Paula, I want a big house with servants," dreamed the woman. "Must be sure to travel abroad, expensive clothes and food." "Grandma, you will have all this," laughed the student. There was not long to wait. The wedding progressed pompously. Paula and Lucas spent their honeymoon in Bali. The girl was so happy. She now and then called her grandmother Chloe and told about how she now lives. But after returning home, everything changed dramatically. First, Lucas started disappearing during the day. Then his absence shifted to the evening, and after a year he didn't spend the night at home. "Lucas," Paula sobbed, "you don't love me at all. You have someone else again." "Darling," he laughed, "but don't sing to me about love. Did you marry me for love? Let me live my life, and I promise I won't touch you." But Paula couldn't. At first, she and her grandmother were afraid of losing such wealth. Her scandals led to the fact that Lucas began to cut her money. The girl did not understand his actions and continued to insist on her own. It ended up that one day Lucas put divorce papers on the table. "I think you realize that now you will leave here with nothing," he said sternly. "Don't even think about suing me, Paula. I'll run you over." And the girl went back to her grandmother. Her granddaughter really bought her a house not so big, which she dreamed of, but still. Chloe also hired 2 servants. "Paula, what are you doing?" she said in shock when she learned that Lucas had divorced her granddaughter. "How are we going to live now?" "Well, we have your house," objected her granddaughter, "so we'll figure something out." This was not in Chloe's plans. And from that moment, the woman began to evict her granddaughter from her house in all sorts of clever ways. "Paula, he's such a good man," advised her grandmother to her granddaughter one man. "He does not smoke and does not drink. He has a flat. So you'll have a place to live. He'll work, and you'll stay at home." "Grandma, he's old," the girl was indignant. "He's 45, and I'm 27. "Well, and nothing," insisted Chloe. "The main thing is that he should provide for you," continued the pressure Camila for several years, and Grandma Paula still managed to persuade her to marry an honorable man. "Well, that's good," Camilla sighed with relief. "I'm finally rid of her. She's going to live in my house. She must have forgotten who is the head and who is the neck. I'll never do anything to my own detriment." And that's where Paula's luck ran out. The man turned out to be a drinker. She put up with him for a few months and went back to her grandmother's house. "You know, Paula, I'm sick of you and your problems." She did not let her granddaughter into her house. "But where am I going, Grandma?" "I'm pregnant. I'm 4 months along and nobody wants to abort me." "Did I sleep with that man?" Chloe was screaming at the top of her voice. "You're the one who started this whole mess. You're the one who has to clean it up." "All right, then I'll show the documents for the purchase of your house and the police, and at least get my share of it." "At the most, you'll be thrown out of here," Paula threatened. The woman was frightened by her words and let Paula into the house. From that moment, she tried to get rid of the girl. "Paula, who will take care of your children?" Chloe once told her. "You're having twins. I can't do it. I can't even count on your mom." "So give them straight to the orphanage," said Chloe unequivocally. "As in the orphanage?" The girl shuddered. "Are you suggesting me to give up my children? And who will feed you and them?" Chloe looked at her sternly. "I don't know," Paula answered with annoyance in her voice. "But it doesn't mean that I have to give them to an orphanage. Do you realize how shameful that would be? And you make sure that no one finds out about it," the woman said slyly. "How?" Paula was surprised. "Everyone here has seen me with a huge belly. And do I tell you about Italy?" Chloe smiled. "There are so many women who find their happiness abroad. I've already found a suitable candidate for you." Chloe jumped up and brought some photo. She showed it to her granddaughter, Paula. "Here you go, Peter." She pointed her finger at the stranger in the photo. "He lives on a farm in Italy. He's a wealthy man. He has vineyards, citrus orchards. How can I go to him by myself?" The girl wouldn't stop. "They won't just let me go to Italy." "Well, for that, there is a marriage bureau," said the grandmother instructively. "I've already learnt everything. I gave your photograph of you in your 20s. You look very pretty there. The agent helped me write a letter 3 days ago," he replied. "That's it, the job is done. Peter is waiting for you." Paula couldn't come to her senses. She had heard, of course, that this was the way to get married nowadays. But not knowing the man at all, the girl could not imagine how one could marry him. "And don't forget," Chloe said sternly, "you have no children, otherwise you will spoil everything. He agreed to marry you only because you don't have children. He wants you to give him children yourself." "So I have to leave my sons in America?" said the girl in shock. "But I can't." "You can," the woman ordered. "Otherwise, you will be left on the street together with them. I won't feed you anymore." Paula could not recover from her conversation with Chloe for a long time. She was tormented by vague doubts. But on the other hand, she realized that she had nowhere to go with these children. She had never worked, she had no money. "Maybe I should leave them to their mother," she pondered. "But the mother can barely walk. She'll give them to the orphanage or they'll take them away from her. Has she been given a disability? No, that option won't work." For days, Paula couldn't decide what to do with the children. The girl was already doing the paperwork for Italy. What if it flashed across her mind? I should definitely leave them to their father. Her mother had said his name was Christian Thompson. No, I can't leave the children to him directly, Paula thought. We'll have to do something clever. I'll first find out where he lives now, and then I'll think of something. One of Paula's old acquaintances worked for the police. He found her information about the children's father. Los Angeles, then? The girl wondered. So I'm due next week. After that, I'll pick up the kids and go there. Maybe I should leave them outside the church with a note. I'll see what they have there. Wow, so many cathedrals and churches. There's even a convent. That's right, a convent. Paula shouted with joy. I'll leave the children there. When Paula boarded the plane, her visa to Italy was already ready. The girl flew to Los Angeles with anticipation. But as soon as she arrived at the convent, there was such a heaviness in her heart that Paula began to doubt her plans. Lord, how am I going to leave them to a complete stranger? She sobbed as she looked at the babies. Maybe he is an alcoholic or some lying invalid. The girl stayed in the hotel for several days. She still did not dare to leave the children yet. She spoke to the Mother Superior several times. Of course, she did not tell what had really happened. I have a few days left, Paula reasoned. I have to make up my mind about something, after all. Paula, don't even think about it. Grandma Chloe shouted into the phone. Over my dead body. If you leave them, not only will I not recognize them, but I'll disown you too. Don't ever count on me again. Even if you become a bum, I'll pass you by, and never throw you a ruble. God, I can't understand anything. Christian wailed, clutching his head. I've never had anyone but Madison. How is that even possible? He looked at the DNA test results for the umpteenth time. The man couldn't come to his senses all evening. He tried to find some reasonable explanation for it, but he was having no luck. It was almost 3 a.m. when he finally went to bed. This time Christian dreamt about the train again. Christian, I love you. Don't go, it was ringing in his ears as the man woke up. Christian sat up abruptly on the bed. The clock read 6:30 in the morning. The man stared at one point on the floor and sat like that for a long time. It can't be. It struck him suddenly. Could it be that one time she had got pregnant? God, he'd never been with anyone else but her. Christian stood up quickly and paced the room. His thoughts drifted to where he had forbidden them to go for so many years. Does it turn out that Sabrina had a daughter by me? He said aloud. But then why didn't our daughter leave the children to her? Maybe. Heavy thoughts tore at his heart. No, not that. Sabrina, was she really dead? He covered his face with his hands and sobbed. I've been running away from my happiness for so many years. But she was waiting for me. I could always feel it. So Sabrina is dead. The thought struck Christian so hard that he couldn't get out of bed that day. I have nothing to live for now, he said to himself. If Sabrina is gone, I am no longer needed here. He lay like that until the evening. Suddenly his phone rang. It was the Mother Superior. Did you get the results of the DNA test? She asked quickly. We need to deal with the issue of the children urgently. Yes, the man replied briefly in a low voice. They are actually my grandchildren. It's an old story from my college days. What have you decided? The nun continued the conversation. Will you keep the boys? I don't know, Christian was confused. Can I think about it for a while, please? All right, do you have until tomorrow? Agreed the woman. I'm sorry, but we can't wait any longer. The children have been staying with us illegally for a whole week. Christian came to his senses. He had some strength in him. The man made himself some hot tea and began to think hard. Okay, I can hire a nanny. So if they don't sleep well at night, I'll at least try to get some sleep during the day, Christian reasoned. I'll get someone from the child welfare office to teach me how to bathe them, feed them porridge, and take them for walks. I'll take them for walks myself. There won't be any problems here, as I won't be able to work now. The state has to pay me some kind of allowance for my children, so I'll have some money. The more Christian thought about the fact that he would keep the children, the more joy appeared in his heart. It's settled, the man finally said, and looked at his watch. The big hand showed noon. The boys will stay with me tomorrow. After the convent, I'll go straight to work and write a letter of resignation. I have so much paperwork to do now. The main thing is that I have my own place and $30,000 in my account. I hope they'll agree to give me the kids. At 9 a.m., Christian spoke to the Mother Superior. I think my daughter's mother is dead, he said with annoyance in his voice. Otherwise, she would have left the children to her. Christian, don't jump to conclusions. The woman looked at him lovingly. I see that woman was dear to you. Yes, he wept. She was the only person I ever loved. I'm sorry I can't contain my emotions. That's why I'm telling you not to jump to conclusions, she advised the guest. Go to the police, they will give you that information. Christian lovingly took the children in his arms. The boys were not frightened of him. After he agreed, the Mother Superior called the guardianship authorities to the convent, so that on the same day they began to register the children with Christian. Christian, you've got to be kidding, Nicholas said in shock. Are you serious? You became a father of 2 little children? Not a father, but a grandfather, Christian corrected Nicholas. Do you think it's so easy to give these little ones to an orphanage? And besides, I can see now that my life has not been in vain. In fact, it was much more complicated than the man had realized. But he didn't give up. The boys woke up at night, one or the other, crying all the time. Christian learned to sleep anywhere and under any circumstances. He even managed to lie down in the intervals when he dipped his spoon into the soup. The care authorities provided a free nanny, nappies, formula, milk, and porridge for the first time. That seems to be everything in that department. Christian checked his list again. On his way home, the man also stopped at a pharmacy. He picked up all sorts of baby hygiene products. The man was so absorbed in his worries that he even forgot that he had made a request to the police. Christian Thompson. There was an unfamiliar voice. It's about your inquiry about Sabrina Smith. The woman is alive and living in Chicago. Will you come to the police station or shall I give you her address? His heart was racing. He hadn't even expected this good news. Dictate the address, Christian answered quickly. He wrote down the address he wanted on a piece of paper, thanked the policeman, and hung up. So Sabrina is alive, he rejoiced. Immediately he was struck with horror. What if she's married? Maybe she gave her daughter to an orphanage. Maybe she never thought of me at all. Once again, Christian was moping. The man didn't know what to do. There was only one reasonable solution: to go to Chicago and meet Sabrina, but he was insanely afraid of that. What will I tell her, he thought. Sabrina, I'm sorry, I'm the very last creature. I didn't tell you then that I already had a fiancée. She won't even listen to me. She'll just close the door in front of me. Christian went crazy for a few days. The only thing that saved him then was his children. He completely immersed himself in taking care of them and forgot about Sabrina for a while, or rather what he was going to do with her now. Here they are, my dear little ones. He carefully placed his grandson on the towel after bathing. Let's wipe our feet. Let's wipe our hands. Let's not forget about the face, Christian said lovingly. Sabrina looked tiredly out the window. It was getting close to Christmas. She had grown used to her loneliness, but still, from time to time, the mental wounds made themselves felt. God, I'm almost 55 and I've never had a life, she sighed. I've failed as a wife and a mother. Sabrina burst into tears. That's why nobody needs me in my old age, the woman sobbed. She took her crutch and went to her wardrobe and pulled out warm clothes. The first snow was already falling outside. After about 30 minutes, Sabrina cautiously made her way down to the yard. Despite the white blankets, it wasn't cold outside. The woman slowly wandered towards a small public garden. She sat down on a bench and closed her eyes. The cool air burned her nostrils. Ba. A baby's voice was heard, and the woman opened her eyes sharply. Standing beside her was a 1.5-year-old child. His mum stood behind him. The baby stomped his little feet and babbled something to his mum. Turning to the young woman, he pointed at Sabrina. Ba. Sabrina's heart warmed. The baby was so funny that she immediately remembered her daughter. She thought it was Paula standing by the bench. Hello, little one. The woman couldn't help herself. Aren't you cold for a walk today? The baby tried to climb into her arms. Ba, he kept repeating. Let's go home, laughed his mum. Your BA is sitting at home. You can't take her outside in this weather. Sabrina looked tenderly at the boy. His mum took the boy in her arms, and he waved all the way to the pram. And Sabrina waved back at him. How funny you two are. At this age, you don't know who you're going to grow up to be. That's why everything is so simple and easy. That's how my Paula used to beg for my arms and call me Mum. And now I don't even know where she is. And tears flowed from Sabrina's eyes. She felt uneasy and got up from the bench. She wanted to walk forward some more, but she wanted to be alone so badly that Sabrina went straight home. She took out old pictures of her daughter, and for a long time she couldn't calm down. Paula, my daughter, she touched the pictures tenderly. How beautiful you are here. I love you so much. That day Sabrina did not do well. First she ate soup, then her can broke. Then there was a knock on her door. Someone had the wrong flat. What's the matter? The woman was cursing. I'm sweating today, so no mood. And then there's all this. Sabrina decided not to do anything else today. She lay down on the sofa and turned on the TV. But thoughts of the past kept her busy that day. In front of Sabrina's eyes was Christian's face. I wonder how his fate turned out, she thought. He probably has a family a long time ago and is happy. Christian once said that he wanted many children, at least 2. He definitely has 1 daughter, and his wife probably has several children. I'd like to see him. He must have changed a lot. And there's not much of the old Sabrina left. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman was immersed in memories of the Institute. She had seen Christian writing his diploma with her, and then defending it so brilliantly. Well done, guys. Shook their hands. That's the bar you have to set. That's the only kind that makes real specialists. Yes, sighed the woman. Everything did not turn out as I would have liked it. I remained a nobody. I hope that at least Christian's life has worked out. It was still nice outside the window, and Sabrina turned off the television. She was getting annoyed with the extraneous sounds, so she turned off the light and just lay there with her eyes open. She felt light at heart, to her surprise. The tears had washed away some of the sadness and sorrow, and the sun showed behind the dark clouds. No one knows what I'm doing all this for, she thought. Maybe it's all for the best. That's how we complain about fate. And then time passes and it becomes clear that it was better for everyone. That's how I cling to Christian and my daughter. I should have let them go a long time ago. Maybe one of them would have come back to me one day. Such a simple thought struck the woman so hard that she thought about it for a long time. Sabrina didn't notice how the evening ended and night fell. The woman woke up when it was 2 on the clock. Wow, she smiled. I don't remember such a bright state of mind. It's like the sun is burning in the middle of my chest. She rejoiced. How I wish I could fall asleep in this state tonight and feel the same tomorrow morning. There is such clarity in my head and peace inside. Sabrina awoke to someone ringing her doorbell for a long time. She jumped up abruptly. It was already 10. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. There was a man standing in front of the door. "Who do you want?" Without opening the door, she asked. "Who do you want?" repeated the woman. "I'm looking for Sabrina." The woman heard the voice and turned pale. The voice sounded familiar to her. She also knew that it was very rare that anyone would call her that. A click was heard and the door opened. Sabrina eyed the intruder with interest. After a few moments, her breath caught. "Well, hello, Sabrina," the man said in a trembling voice. "I'm sorry to drop in you unannounced. We could have a word with you." The woman hesitantly opened the door to the flat and only now noticed the portable pram. The guest picked it up and entered. Sabrina couldn't say a word out of shock. Her legs were shaking, and she sat down on a chair. "What is it, Christian?" she finally said, looking at the cradle. "It's a long story," the man tried to smile. "We could put the children on the bed for the time being, because they had already had a rough flight." A baby cried. A second one cried after him. Sabrina pulled the boy out with trembling hands and put him on the couch. Christian took the nappies out of a large bag and, like a true professional, changed them for the children in seconds. "We haven't eaten anything since this morning," the man said carefully. "We'd better make some porridge." Sabrina watched what was happening and could not believe her eyes. She was so amazed that she couldn't even find the words. Christian was in the kitchen. He quickly prepared the baby's food and put the bottles to cool. Then he sat down on a chair and looked intently at the hostess. "Sabrina, are these our grandchildren?" he said calmly. "Our daughter gave them to me." Sabrina couldn't believe it. "Paula, did you have her?" "No. She left the twins at the convent. She put a note in the basket for the nuns to find me," he said, trying to hold back tears. "Sabrina, I adopted our boys." Finally, the woman couldn't take it anymore and cried loudly. Christian soothed her. "Christian, how can you do this?" she said through her tears. "How could Paula do such a thing?" "I don't know," Christian answered briefly. "Sabrina, I'm sorry." The man couldn't bear it and cried. "I acted like a bastard. I didn't tell you that I had a fiancé at home. I took advantage of the opportunity that day. I didn't want to marry Madison. You were the only one I ever loved, but my dad made me do it. I'm so sorry." "But why didn't you tell me about it then?" The woman sobbed even more. "I've waited all my life for you." "For many years I had forbidden myself to think about you," Christian confessed honestly. "But after my wife died many years ago, I was afraid that you had a family and that you were happy." God, how stupid we are. Sabrina got up from her chair and walked over to Christian. "We've wasted so many years," Sabrina exclaimed. "No," he hugged her. "We're just getting started. Let's go feed our children." The woman took one bottle and put one baby in her arms. The boy gobbled greedily. Sabrina watched the baby, and with each passing minute her heart filled with love for him. She furtively looked at Christian. The man was so happy, he was just glowing. This is what I had to go through all the trouble for, the woman thought, wiping away her tears with one hand. Nothing happens for nothing. Everything that happens to us has meaning. Christian looked at Sabrina lovingly. He had been so dreading this meeting, but it had happened so unexpectedly that he just couldn't believe it all. The man and woman never doubted that this was the best day of their lives. The boys ate and fell fast asleep. Sabrina and Christian went into the kitchen. They had a lot to talk about. They were starting a new phase of their lives and had a lot of issues to deal with. "Thank you for being able to understand and forgive me tonight," Christian said to her. "Daddy, Mummy." There were voices in the yard. "Where are you? Are you in the garden?" "Martin, Jasper, we're here." Waved his hands at an old man near an old cherry tree. The brothers went into the garden. On the way they discussed something animatedly. Finally, they saw their parents. "Well, can I congratulate you?" asked the mother. "How was the defense?" Martin and Jasper studied in New York. After graduating from school in Chicago, their teachers advised Christian that his son should go to university in New York. Both boys had simply amazing abilities. Martin studied to be a computer programmer, and Jasper, in contrast, became an art historian. But the brothers weren't confused by their different majors. They always had something to talk about. After Christian came to Sabrina, they decided to stay in Chicago. The man was fine with that. He sold his flat in Los Angeles, and he and Sabrina were able to buy a large, well-appointed house with a large garden. At first, they tried to have the boys call them grandparents. But when they were 8 years old, Martin declared that Sabrina and Christian were parents to them. From that point on, they never had any questions about it. Having had a negative experience with Paula, Sabrina was initially very afraid that her sons would grow up and abandon them. But the boys didn't just grow up grateful. They loved their parents wholeheartedly. "We are very grateful to you for investing so much in us," the sons often said. "And most of all, thank you for finding the strength and not giving us to the orphanage." The boys came home for a few weeks. They both had jobs in New York and good prospects. "Martin, Jasper," their father told them one day, "your mother and I don't mind if you choose to stay in New York. You are adults and should decide for yourselves what you want to be and where you want to live." Christian and Sabrina looked fondly at their sons. Their parents had arranged a dinner party for them in honor of their diploma. Of course, both realized that they were old. Both of them were to turn 78 this year. "Now I can leave in peace," Christian thought. "My life hasn't gone to waste. I thank God that one day 2 nuns knocked on my door.